Hi everyone. So similar to Bogwall, we're just going to go through the motions that were in the SSDC ProAm this year, talk about what arguments you could have run. This will probably be most useful for those individuals that maybe need more help at argument generation, or those that would wish to do like whatever you call it, like motion targeting, where you're meant to prep a motion on your own. If you find that you don't have time or you don't have the motivation to do that, this might be useful just to hear someone talk about some arguments that you could have run. So let's have a look at the ProAm motions this year. So, round one this year, quite a bog standard motion. So this house believes children rather should be taught to disobey authority. So nothing really too intricate or special about this motion. Although it is worth pointing out that in most motions about education, and especially those involving children, or some narrative that is educated to any individual, particularly children, characterization and framing becomes probably the most crucial thing in the debate. What I mean by that is nothing too fancy, but just literally explaining what this teaching looks like, why it looks the way you think it looks like, and explaining what impact that will have, and then trying to be as nuanced as possible, right? It is unlikely you're going to get a pair of 85s and win from top off by presuming that there is one type of parent and one type of child, or that there is one type of message that will be internalized in one type of way. The complexity of this debate and the skill of this debate comes from appreciating that nuance and trying to be as nuanced with the argumentation that you develop. This not just unlocks a diversity of other impacts, but probably just makes these debates significantly more intellectually interesting, as honestly speaking, it's not the case that you can stand an opening government and probably have a very certain impact, like we're going to make children, be nice people now because different children will react to this differently as different parents teach this to different levels based on their lived experience. So let's have a look at some of the arguments built on that warning about characterization that you could have run in this debate. So let's have a look at all four positions. So let's start with opening government. So probably quite intuitive impacts you could run, i.e. why it might be good to teach children to disobey authority might be the idea of the narrative or the way in which you're teaching kids to disobey authority may not actually make them disobey authority, but the way you're educating them, i.e. what kind of questions you're making them answer when they are disobeying authority, might be instrumentally useful. So you can see that this is a one type of way to understand the characterization I mentioned previously when we talked initially about the motion. Like, you could say in opening government that the way in which parents would teach this idea would be in a way that means that you question authority and delegitimize it through a degree of critical thinking, i.e. i.e. parents would tell children that you should not just do something just because someone tells you to do it. You should think about whether or not it is moral or not, or something that is in your interests or not, or something that aligns with your values or not. Obviously, the way in which different children of different age groups, different nationalities, different conditions in life will be taught this varies considerably. And this is a strategic commentary that you have to think about and prep to what type of children you want to talk about and why. So recognize the second part of this motion is this is not necessarily a motion about pure consequences, right? There is in the wording of the motion a more principled requirement required, i.e. that this actor should be doing something. So a part of this means that you have to think about why it is good in and of itself to be taught this thing, even if being taught it results in good things. This is not necessarily the only way or the sufficient way to win the debate. So other than things like independent thinkers, i.e. making kids learn better, challenge or think better by the critical reasoning skills you may developed to them, other argumentation you could have developed, maybe you try to hit more consequential impacts more broadly across children, i.e. maybe you want to frame that kids are likely to disobey authority regardless, because kids be kids. They don't like being told what to do, especially within those kids that don't like being told what to do. So perhaps there is a way in which parents can, with that frame of mind in children, make them operate when they're disobeying with authority in a more constructive way. So this may be is where you bring in comparative work, right? So on opposition side in opening government, you could frame the idea that likely the people teaching children are a diversity of different actors, probably mostly parents, probably mostly teachers, and the way in which they will be taught to obey authority might be unitary or singular in its approach, i.e. because of the strapped amount of resources and time, parents and teachers may try to just appeal to the overall notion that authority is a good thing and the overall notion that it's something that should be agreed with. with this can make just seem unintuitive to children, as in children are smarter than you may give them credit for. They may recognize that some types of authority are not as good as others. They probably recognize this when they notice contradictions in the way in which laws, penalties, and teachings are educated, as in it is likely that, at least even intuitively, you probably recall this in your own life, there are times when your parents may have told you to do one thing for one reason, but then told you to do another thing which contradicts that own reason. So, being nice to, like, the thing that comes to my mind is the way in which, well, at least my parents taught me about lying and the distinction between white lies and different types of lies were not that apparent to me, because the reasoning underpinning them, because my parents weren't that well educated, necessarily was confusing to me. And you can see this as an exemplification about why, actually, if you're teaching your kid to disobey authority, the way in which you're going to educate them is likely to be aligned to what they already know to be true, which is that there are some authorities that should not be educated, and thus the median parent with median amount of time and median amount of interest and skills may be on aggregate better able to teach the idea of disobeying authority than be able to teach the idea of obeying authority. Therefore, on balance of numbers and balances of success, you can attack the median impact here, as in the average individual kid affected. The last idea is maybe that authority can be uniquely damaging to kids, right? So it might be the case that authorities, conservative or traditional parenting or traditional education systems that want to do things like rote learning and teaching you to unwavering loyalty to the rules of schools that sometimes don't make any sense, i.e. like, don't talk to your friends, be careful not to share answers with people, etc. It's something that could be uniquely disengaging, and it may be just more dangerous if you tell them if you try to make them seem as if they should appeal to authority, because sometimes that authority harms them, and sometimes the kids will doubly reject authority. So what I mean by that is, if you teach the kid to disobey authority, presumably this means structures exist now that are more tolerant of individuals who disobey authority, which means those kids that may naturally rebel, or those that rebel for legitimate reasons, i.e. their own safety, or just the fact that the system is not working for them. Particularly, imagine individual instances of like neurodivergent individuals in education that don't like the rigid set of formalities and rules that maybe does not align with some idiosyncrasies of their own personalities or their mentality. And by teaching kids to disobey authority, you may be engineering systems that make it easier for these individuals to exist in society. What you can see here is there is a large range of also quite intuitive impacts, which make this debate, at least from a closing half perspective that I'll talk about later, a bit confusing to predict, as in this debate can go many different ways, and the questions that you'll ask yourself in open government, other than just what arguments do I like running or what arguments am I best at running, may just simply depend on what actors you think are easiest to weigh and easiest to prove. So a key strategic question you might ask yourself, as in depending on what actor you want to pick, is unfortunately a lot of meta questions, i.e. who am I against? Who are my judges? What are the people who I am against likely to run? Who are my judges likely to credit? As in, the judges that are judging me more likely interested in scalable impacts, as in simplistic or in some cases actually quite complex ways of judging debates, as in very metric-based, very scale-based, or are they more into characterization and intuitions, in which case you might want to be very specific about a sub-actor, even if it is a smaller scale actor. So those are some ideas you can run in opening government. So when it comes to opening opposition, so we talked a little bit about what you might want to run from opening opposition. The first thing is a lot of the maybe strategic framing that can exist in opposition bench is universal to most education debates that involve children, which is a lot of the debate functions on government side being able to access a degree of nuance in the education. So as you can tell, it took me 6 minutes to explain 3 impacts, maybe an expression that I'm not a very good debater or it's 11 o'clock at night. But all of these impacts from government that we've already talked about rely upon the education being nuanced. So the first thing probably an opening opposition team could do, and probably should do to a certain extent, is to argue why it can't be taught nuancely, or at least in the instances opening and closing government may want them to be taught nuancely, they're unlikely to be so. Here you might want to access framing that is probably already present to a certain extent in opening government, or at least in the judges' minds, about the time and resource-strapped nature of parents, the fact that educational facilities are often resource-strapped, which means they don't necessarily cater to nuances or discrepancies in how different kids will interpret different results, or at least not educating in a non-universal way. as in they're likely to prescribe disobeying authority in a way that is universalized, and therefore may miss the nuanced impacts, like with neurodivergent individual kids, or within some parents who are likely to be counter the rebellion of their kids. As in, you can think of structural reasons why some kids, even, and maybe this is a stereotype, but maybe kids are more likely to rebel when they have conservative parents in the first place, which is a piece of framing to why these conservative parents are unlikely to be able to teach disobeying authority in a way that is nuanced against their own intrinsic beliefs of conservatism, i.e. the value of authority, etc. There may be like specific prescriptions about what disobeying authority looks like only to specific circumstances, only in specific ways, only in limited ways, etc. This is probably this piece of framing that ought to come out. I think it dismantles at least the most persuasive argumentation, particularly those in closing government that may be more mechanistically adept in ways that a POI wouldn't be able to rebut them. Yeah, so let's look at actual impacts you could also flow on the counter, as in just reasons why presumably teaching to not disobey authority is a good thing. The first is you could just plainly argue that actually authority is quite a safe thing. So things like anti-bullying probably requires authority to be legitimate, or to be perceived as legitimate amongst other individuals, right? So if you're teaching to disobey authority, it's likely even in a nuanced interpretation, a part of that means that there is something that authority doesn't have a unique objective power, and you as an actor, even beneath that authority, have the right to challenge the premises that operates on. What that probably means is a lot of signaling that happens from parents to kids and teachers to kids may be seeking to undermine the legitimacy of where authority flows from. Because even in the maybe more high-level conceptualization of authority, you could probably easily persuade an opening opposition, the judges, that authority, to disobey something that is authoritative, means fundamentally to not see it as an authority, right? Not see it as someone who is trusted blindly to an individual. What this probably means is a lot of things that require legitimacy, like the fear or irrational fear of backlash, or the overwhelming fear that that authority has an overwhelming power on you, may be undermined in certain key instances like bullying. It's also the case that maybe it just delegitimizes adult figures in general to some kids. Like, I'm not saying this just means that no kid ever trusts an adult or no kid ever actively buys into adults' education. Like, it obviously is the case that sometimes children will be able to appreciate nuance between disobeying the authority of a bad teacher versus disobeying authority of your parent. But you can imagine, based on the framing of how this is unlikely to be educated in a nuanced way, why it might undermine in certain critical instances the guidance that you may place into an adult. As in, for instance, you can imagine teaching kids to disobey authority doesn't just mean the kid only believes the circumstances you've given them to disobey authority, but may apply those lessons and reverse them to the person teaching the authority in the first place. I.e., there may be kids that would have already bought in unsymmetrically to either of the narratives parents give them, but it's almost like giving a bomb to the kid that's going to believe the parents in order to not believe the parents. And in this way, it can undermine maybe the relationship that exists between children and parents if the child no longer believes the parent is a monolith of authority, particularly at a younger age. And it's also maybe more nuanced to appreciate there are different actors that will vie and buy into this narrative to differing degrees, which means there are maybe, even if you teach a kid to disobey authority, there are some individuals who may counter this narrative naturally, as it explains that authority is a legitimate thing to do, and maybe some children buy into that warm, nice notion that authority is important, as in you can appreciate the level of nuances and complexities you could use within this argumentation as mechanistic proof to why authority is important in certain instances and is always going to be undermined in certain instances by government side. So that's one argument you could run. A second argument is maybe just its education becomes worse. Like there's even if authority causes some bad aspects, as in kids become disgruntled, etc., you could try to weigh that in the vast majority of instances, authority is what stops the classroom from descending into more disorder, which maybe is important for not having educational disruption, as in kids being able to focus on lessons, kids being more likely to turn up because of fear of deterrence or retaliation, and actually valuing that retaliation in a certain extent, i.e. they fear parents will work out that they're not at school, or will fear the backlash they get from them. And that just makes them have worse educational opportunities. I think the advantage of this argument is probably quite evident that I was able to explain it in 25 seconds, which means it's probably quite an intuitive argument to run that has very clear impacting and very clear severity in the round. Maybe the mechanisms require a little bit more elucidation and thought, as in there is a layer of simplistic argumentation that proves the impact, but there's probably also a layer of nuanced argumentation that is necessary to prove the full force of this impact and to have it reside in the entire round. As in, the burdens placed upon this argument are quite can be as complex as the previous arguments. As in, firstly, why is the narrative successful in changing the minds of people in authority, which probably you can just agree with government bench that has some influence, and this is just a classic way of trying to flip government bench. The second burden rather, is why the way in which kids will view the authority, specifically from teachers and educational institutions, actually has the most bearing, or a uniquely positive bearing, on the interaction that they have. You can imagine here a closing government team would try to respond to this argument by breaking apart the sub-stakeholders. As in, they might say there may be potentially a subsection of stakeholders that would have their education undermined as a result of the pure belief that they shouldn't respect the teacher teaching them. There may be another type of kid, per part of the opening government analysis, that now respects the teacher more because the teacher is representing a view that they already knew was true, which is that authority is not a legitimate circumstance, is not legitimizing in and of itself, and it requires defense. Here you can imagine the closing government specific response angle would be, to disobey authority doesn't mean to always remove authority, it just means authority needs to legitimize itself, which means authority, as in teachers, would have to justify why people should buy into them, which actually would be more likely for individuals to listen to a teacher, because it's probably just humanizing, but also might be just rationally justified. And you can imagine how that is quite a compelling response to the education argument that would require a preemptive, nuanced argument about why that is unlikely to be true. Maybe this is based upon the idea of weaknesses in the time and energy and skills of teachers to develop this, but also might just be the case that, like the social intuition, that different people are different people act differently in different circumstances. So maybe you have one nuanced teacher that is able to teach what closing government's response was, but then there's another teacher that just frankly doesn't care about justifying themselves, and therefore you can preemptively flip this argument by saying, yes, you give kids the expectation that authority should have to defend itself, but in the vast majority of circumstances, maybe just because of ego, etc., parents and teachers won't wish to self-justify themselves to an 11-year-old, and it will just demand authority, but now they don't have a narrative that commands respect that actually gives them that authority, which is probably the nuanced mechanism to why our education may become worse. And you could frame that there are critical areas of education that become worse, as in like 11 to 12 is probably quite critical in terms of linguistic development and just obedience development that can trickle along to the rest of your life. The mech here could be compound disobedience, as in if you're disobedient at a younger age, as you tend to a different level of education, as in going from primary to secondary school, it's often the case that educational institutions will flag future educational institutions of the disobedient levels of kids, as in the kids that are majorly disobedient, i.e. those that have a high detention rate, etc. Those are like selectively looked at by behavioral units and teachers as someone to watch out for, which can become a positively reinforcing cycle. As in, you fear that this kid has had a lot of detentions at the previous school, you therefore positively select into behaviors that you know would have been expected of a detention regular kid, and therefore you see those behaviors more often, you give them more and more detentions, is the mech there. So you can see how that education argument works. The last is one I've already touched on, which is the idea that maybe questioning is the end point of opening government and closing government, but just why this becomes worse, as in authority becomes potentially more punitive, i.e. the questioning that I've just talked about exists, but then there are types of teachers, and you can here give the incentive structures of head teachers and academy systems that are accountable to individuals who aren't parents, and usually government district boards that are just asking for educational results, etc., and the political incentives for that, and why this just maybe weakens their authority in order to get results, which means they have to do more punitive things, as in they have to overextend their authority. So this becomes like giving people more detentions, putting people back at school more, trying to crack down further, and why this may produce a compounding harm, particularly to the mental health of kids that are more likely to rebel in the first place. But it might just, in certain instances, especially in the schools I came from, more kids get kicked out as a result, maybe. As you can see, this argument gets to probably a significant impact, but is very much dependent upon the nuanced analysis of that, how the world is going to look when kids are taught this, right? So that argument completely depends upon this teaching being, even if it is nuanced, like an arms race between two actors, which you can quite intuitively see why that wouldn't happen in the vast majority of circumstances, why there would be mediation, why there would be moderation to the center. So to be careful with the impact, but there are certainly some areas you can go. As in, even if you prove two more kids get out of school, or get kicked out of school. That is actually quite a significant and certain impact. That can impact quite, it can be an impact in of itself. So that's some ideas for opening opposition. So let's have a look at closing government. So material from closing government could just be, and as probably quite evident, elucidating the nuances that took me 50 minutes to explain. So a lot of this debate from closing half probably just revolves around nuancing the arguments of your top half and clearing out the comparative. And it is quite likely, considering that this is a round one and therefore randomly allotted rooms, that it's going to be very unlikely you had two top half teams that were, engaging the level of nuance and the level of like back and forth that I've just talked about. So there's probably plenty of responsive challenges and plenty of analytical extensions to make things more nuanced in terms of why kids think the way they do, or why parents act the way they do, or why teachers act the way they do, or why there's going to be no moderation or some moderation. Leaving that aside, there are probably two additional argumentation that probably can exist from closing government. Here, like all positions in extension, it is usually trying to step out of the realms of what the immediate debate looks like and seeing the impacts that could exist beyond that. So one could be the idea that, okay, kids eventually grow up. How does this narrative, presuming it does impact kids and presuming it does stay with kids, impact them when they leave education? So one idea could be maybe this lesson is effective in making individuals more likely to be, children be more likely to be critical thinkers and to not respect authority in the first place. But actually maybe opening opposition would be correct, that there would be moderative influences like the fact that school is a very caged environment, a very protected environment. That would mean most of the positive couldn't accrue for opening government. However, when you leave school, maybe more kids get access to critical education as a result of this narrative, which means because become more effective, rational actors when they leave school. This could be things like social activists. Maybe you make more social activists. Maybe they question social institutions' practices, think more creatively, are more confident as a result of the fact that they don't think authority is something to be scared of. Obviously, quite intuitively, a lot of kids naturally reject authority anyway, so be careful about what the delta is here. But you can just think about why this would be a priori good in terms of ego, in terms of just interpersonal relationships and the self-perception and confidence of your own intellect. A second way in which you could think about impacting into the long run is specifically just about how authority changes, right? So I imagine a lot of the top half teams, much like I actually did, will start their prep and maybe start their argumentation looking at this has now been implemented right now. And then the deputy speeches will be like, okay, there's a medium term where things start to level out. In closing government, and similarly in closing opposition, you could just take it out even further. So what would happen if this had happened from in 50 years' time, right? You could argue that maybe authority would have become better in some key respects. Maybe it may be more collaborative. Maybe the way in which authority is educated from a young age becomes that is more likely to listen to individual kids because they don't want to create the friction that may cause things like backlash, per the last argument I have in the opening opposition box. You can be creative here. There are probably a lot of small and large impacts about how authority becomes better in many key respects, either to different types of kids in different types of circumstances, as in to poor kids, to rich kids, to bright kids, to dumb kids, etc. I shouldn't have used the word dumb. You know what I meant. Some kids are dumb. All of this may mean that authority becomes better, and you can try to think about how this would set the moral standard maybe for other authority institutions, maybe policing institutions, health institutions, local government institutions, maybe the boardroom, maybe corporations, because the people who are being educated this way will grow up presumably buying into some version of the narrative. You can be creative about how you're analyzing what that version is. Obviously, this is where you get more into debater land, as in you don't want to overestimate that now everything becomes progressive, even if that was a good thing, and liberal, even if that was a good thing. But you can be creative here. So these are two ideas you could have in closing government. So what about in closing opposition? So there are a few more broad ideas you could have. The first is that maybe, I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about here, maybe bringing the idea about long-termism back into the debate, as in just this is maybe what the closing off strategy is. You could think about the way in which our understanding of authority would be severely changed as a result of the way this is being taught. So I think the reason that this premise is maybe something that you want to consider accepting in closing opposition is it limits the responsive challenge you have to do to both government teams. It's because let's presume you had a good debate where gov teams are quite nuanced and have very complex and probably quite persuasive reasoning to why kids will internalize this in a good way and will actually disobey authority in a meaningful way. Probably the strategy from closing opposition here is to take a responsive burden, i.e. taking opening and closing government as their best, as in not using rebuttal to mitigate their arguments, but actually saying why their arguments with their full force are actually still a bad thing, and think about why certain systems require authority. The first might be things like what I called consistent spiritualism, whatever the hell that means. I think what I mean by this is that there are certain systems where authority and its objectivity and its perception to not be underminable, which is not a word, but you know what I mean, is actually quite necessary. So this could be things like religious justifications. This may make kids more likely to reject certain types of religious teaching and maybe become more rational and critical thinking in a way that is quite bad. As in maybe they reject certain types of warm messaging, as in spiritual messaging, because they don't respect authority generally. As you can probably see, this is a strange and unintuitive argument that would require some good exemplification for most judges. As in, the first thing a debater will say in response, if I just left my argument at that, would be, well, religion is not an a priori good thing. There is coercion in religion, so it's good for people to undermine that, obviously. But there are some aspects of belief systems that demand authority, as in being able to get good aspects of the problem of evil comes down to the idea that there is an intrinsic aspect of faith which only flows in its persuasiveness from the idea of overall authority. You can see this is a very left of field, or leftist, whatever the bloody phrase is called. This very out there idea, but is an idea that can definitely differentiate yourself if you're struggling to find differentiable material. And a lot of debating can, I think, too much become really bogged down in the basic, intuitive, boring argumentation, and this is maybe an example of a more fun argument you could run from closing opposition. You can think about how, secondarily, this could apply to other types of institutions, as I mentioned, in closing government. So you can think about how this may undermine the way in which children, as they grow up, or children themselves, have faith in certain other types of authority institutions that are quite important. Things like the police may increase skepticism, may reduce, therefore, positive interactions, or any interactions at all, and that might preclude individuals from having any degree of positive projections in the criminal justice system. The intuition that appeals to me here, although it might be a bit out there, is, like the defund the police movement is good in the sense that it rises, at least calls to issues about police discrimination. But if you consider the ways in which that may be interpreted by some people, and maybe kids, I don't know, might be to think the idea that the approach is just binary, as in the thing is good or bad. And this may mean that, obviously, this requires some degree of interaction with the complexities of the nuance of the argument that comes from government about how kids interpret this. This may mean that certain types of institutions are fundamentally rejected because they're built on authority. You can think about the ways in the medium term the police use the idea of authority, and the law itself uses the idea of authority to command respect and command compliance, and how this might be a bad thing if you actively teach kids to disobey it in the first place. The last is maybe just creates apathetic future citizens. As in, if kids are taught to disobey authority, and there are some kids that don't appreciate the nuances of authority and don't use their full capacities as intellectual reasoning to accept that authority still has its place, even if you don't obey it all of the time, and instead just think disobeying authority means rejecting authority, you can think about how this makes individuals more apathetic because authority systems won't change. This could be responding to the idea of leading to worse authority in the future, which probably scales to the rest of the top half about why it makes kids better or worse. If you're able to prove in closing opposition that future citizens, as in future parents, recognize that whilst they may teach this idea, authority remains a permanent structure, may create apathy and therefore create lack of collective action, which reduces the capacity to change the system in the first place, increasing things like disengagement with authorities systems. You can think about the way in which authorities actually changes to collective action to challenge the authority, but in a way that doesn't seek to undermine it, right? Because if you're trying to undermine authority, that usually means you're replacing the authority with something that is not authoritative, as in, collective systems of equal ownership or equal authority. And you can think about how systems are probably the most effective when they are hierarchical, in the sense that they have single, unitary, or very small numbers of authority figures that have therefore accountability to them, but also accountability by others to them, and how this may be bad as a result. As you can see, in the closing opposition ideas, provided the intuitive material is not taken, there is plenty of scope and complexities in this debate. I think this is what makes children and these types of debates about narratives towards children really interesting from an intellectual level, hence why I spent half an hour talking about it already, and this is only motion 1. So hopefully this is some ideas about arguments that you could have run. Cool. Cool, so let's think about round 2. So, round 2, this house prefers a world where the ownership model for professional UK football clubs follows the democratic model. So, classic sports motion, right? You will get sports motions every now and again. They have broadly the same clashes. You have what is the value of sports? You have where do sports become more wealthy? Then you have the reframing and closing half that money doesn't matter. What matters is the degree of ownership people have over it, because that means they get into the system. What I think this motion does is it brings forward the later clash, or the latter clash that often exists in general sports motions, and brings it front and center. So the comparative we have here is whether or not we have private ownership on opposition side, i.e. economic interests or organizational interests like the Saudi investment fund, or on the government side, people actually having, I've blocked myself out. Anyway, people having referenda democracy. Democracy is not a good thing. Anyway, let's have a look at some arguments you can run to open and govern. Quite intuitively, the first argument that should have popped out straight to you is just more representation, right? I think there are 2 ways you could have interpreted this representation, and therefore 2 arguments you can make. First is a soft argumentation of representation, and the second is a hard argument of representation. I don't mean soft and hard in terms of burdens of proof. I just mean on the how much you're going to buy into the idea of representation being an a priori good, and therefore how much weighing you will have to do about why representation is the be-all and end-all. Let's look what I mean by that. Probably the soft argument is, okay, what the democratic model will do is not preclude access to professional UK football owners, or who would have been on opposition side, i.e. the funders, the big money interests, etc. All it will do is make these professional actors have to create more detailed plans, articulate manageable goals, and nevertheless create an a priori accountability mechanism that makes them more effective actors. So this soft version of representation is not really representation, it's a form of gateway representation, i.e. this form of argument could be to claim opposition bench is correct preemptively in their argumentation to why professional clubs are more effective at managing the cup. However, there are limitations on their effectivity, i.e. their lack of accountability, the lack of foresight, and the lack of planning. All we want to do on government side is to instrumentalize democracy in order to make these people more effective at their job, because we agree with the vast majority of the impacts that come from opposition. You can see how this is strategically good if you want to fuck over your closing government, but also it's quite strategically good as in it's strategically good in the sense that it means that a lot of opening opposition angles have to engage with you. It's also unstrategic in the sense that you limit the amount of things that opposition bench have to do to beat you. So there are different circumstances where you want these different things. We don't have a video on strategy. I don't know if I'll ever do a video on strategy. It's something that seems intuitive, but this comes from experience. In terms of the hard version of this argument, it could be the case that you're willing to bite the bullet that the democratic model will likely preclude clubs going over and having control to professional individuals. As in, there are some instances where the professional organizations, as opposition will see, may argue, won't wish to buy into systems they have no higher level of ultimate control over. All those maybe secondarily would be outright rejected for irrational reasons, as in they don't want the Saudis to control their football club. They don't want financial actors that are perceived to be elitist and perceived to be disconnected from the sports and perceived to be parasites from ever being involved in the game in the first place. Here, in the hard version, you could just accept opposition's comparative to a certain extent. That means you have less money, potentially therefore less big clubs, potentially therefore less amount of investment, but this is just a good thing. As in, democracy probably increases the power of the fans, which probably means fans buy into a greater or certain extent, or at least the club becomes a more representative portion of who they want the club to be. Here you could have a principal justification to why representation is the be-all and end-all, as in, football clubs often are identity formation, particularly for working class communities, in a way that is unconsensual. As in, you do not consent into the football club that you are, or you're born into, or the identity is tied to, so they owe certain reparatory duties to you. In one way, this is just representation to mold the shape of that club in the way you want it to be shaped to. This requires argumentation, obviously principled argumentation, but also some argumentation about why there's a unified perspective on identity and some degree of representation to why the model would actually be effective in representing. That's a harder version of the argument you can make. Whichever argument you want to run is the argument you want to run. Whatever one, it depends what your metrics and incentives are. If you want to have fun, do the hard argument. If you want to win the debate, probably do the soft argument. In terms of flow and impacts, you can see, I think, how representation, as both in the soft and the hard version, have flow and impacts you could try to grab from opening government, just gobble up all the impacts so the closing government are burned. Things like economic equality could be important. You can consider how, with a democratic model, maybe this reduces the overall power or cannibalism that private companies have, which means there aren't such great disparities in economic power between companies, in football clubs to an extent. As in, you can imagine that professional clubs often make mistakes, as in they siphon money to themselves, which creates a degree of backlash and resentment from the fans, which means the next generation of fans would vote in referenda to get rid of them. And that means the money gets cycled around because there's always a degree of profitability from clubs that are willing to accept you versus those that won't accept you. And that's good just for inequality, as in it's good that some people have more money because they get a greater access to the game. And insofar as you did not choose where to be born, you should prioritize in the debate giving the most number of people access, not the most number, but like different people access at different points in time, such that the aggregate over time is higher, access to a good version of the game, which would be conceding to the metric that the positive version of the game is not you own your club, but that you do well and have loads of money and have loads of sponsors, like scouts and shit. And maybe the value of the game comes from its competitivity. Or oftentimes their arguments are outframed by the idea that the joy of sports is just the uncertainty of not knowing you're doing it, but also just the community that is built around losing even if you do. Which is, I say that quite, flippantly, but I do find that a compelling piece of framing in certain respects. Anyway, other flown arguments could be things like lower corruption by the accountability mechanisms. Think about corruption isn't a priori bad, as in it siphons off money from vulnerable communities. It may mean that you are financially less viable to other private actors, and using the soft argument, it just makes you more of a reliable financial actor such that you can secure greater or continual amounts of professional club ownership support. When different owners buy out different owners, they're more likely to do so if they have a viable financial asset. So if you lower degree of corruption, maybe this improves the viability of that asset, and therefore you get consistently larger money. Then you can weigh why the long-term viability of the sport matters, because it's arbitrary what time in the expanded universe you existed in. So you should prioritize the club being existing for as long as possible, so more people can experience it. Cool. The last argument could just be things like capital flight. So a specific aspect of the info slide in this motion was whether or not people can pull out money, which just activates stock argumentation you may have about why capital controls in developing countries are good. I say that as if you have this stock in your head somewhere. You're like, oh yes, I remember that argument from round 3 of Ancients 2 years ago, where you might think it's just a uniquely good thing to not allow professional clubs to pull out loads of money and allow clubs to enter into limbo of failing states, and how at least having some money in, even if it's less money, because companies would be more reticent about giving you a large amount of money if they didn't know they could pull it out, is preferable than having a large amount of money pull out very quickly, which may happen if there is a scandal, if, as often corporations do, they diversify their money across risk factors, and it might be the case that one of their risky assets has failed, which means they need to pull out money so they can have liquidity to not go bankrupt or not to lose more investors in their own company, which is 2 reasons to why investors would pull out money from football clubs in the first place. And you can weigh this in multiple respects, i.e. competitivity, enjoyment of the sports, viability of the club, how representative the club will be, because oftentimes when clubs are in more dire financial situations, even in the democratic model, they may be more likely, or even just universally more likely to have to accept worse terms and services in order to get money to buoy the club, right? Because if a financial asset is failing, you have less leverage to get better conditions for yourself. So if you're preventing the club from being deteriorated because it's in a poor monetary position, you have more power and more power leverage in order to extract better terms and therefore more representation. So you see there's a lot of arguments for opening government. A lot of them flow from the way in which representation happens. Probably the strategy from opening government is try to gobble up as much as possible, not be too greedy, so don't under-explain argumentation, but make sure you have a focus on what your metric is. Is your metric representation? Is your metric economic viability? Is your metric competitivity? Is your metric longevity? Don't try to mix these things together, because there are some pieces of analysis that contradict each other, as in forms of representation. Argumentation on representation being better than anything else contradicts with some analysis to why economic viability is important, because a lot of argumentation about economic viability comes at the cost of violating some aspects of representation, and having to accept having less power less influence, etc. So be careful about that kind of interlocking. But those are the 4 metrics, 5 metrics you might want to think about in opening government and argumentation that flows from that. Opening opposition, already touched on some of this. So I think opening opposition's burden here is just to prove financial actors be good, financial actors be better when they don't have people who aren't financial actors telling them what to do, and finance and that kind of professionalism in sports is what makes sports best for everybody. Those are probably the 3 questions or the 3 things you have to, if you prove well, probably wins you from in opening opposition. So let's think about the first thing, which is just fans impair the survivability of clubs. Here you could implement economic analysis to why the best types of professional actors, i.e. those that have the most money, the most connections, are often those that want a high level of control, want to be able to pull out their money further, and want literally the last say in predictability that comes from being able to be in control. What the democratic model does is it deprives these financial actors of having that ultimate last say, which means they're less likely to risk their money, which means maybe you crowd out good financial actors and you increase the risky financial actors that are willing to put money into your club, knowing that they can't pull it out. These are likely corporations or professional actors that are risky in general, which means they're more likely to be financially bad actors because they take too much risk and don't have any liquidity to back them up. Here, that impairs the survivability of clubs because you don't have a reliable financial actor with a good incentives, a good accountability, and a good metric, which means when the company, when these financial actors do badly or they can't pull their money out, they do worse decisions that impair the economic survivability of a club. This is bad because you need economics to get people in the door, to get future sponsorships, to have the long-term longevity of your company, to have good players that makes good games, to get good scouting, which means you have consistently good games and competitivity. How that ratchets also from sponsorship, as in if you're going down the league, which means you have fewer eyes on you, you get less good sponsors, which means you get raced to the bottom in terms of economic development, and things also additional flow and impacts, right? How football clubs, if they're doing successful, often create a buzz around them, which creates investment into the local area. Sports clubs often try to develop local talent, and the more money they have, the more local development and academies around them they can develop. Also the case, especially for larger clubs, if you're allowing economic inequality, you pool resources, so you have economies of scale and things like Manchester United, which means you can maybe invest in other areas of the world that are deprived in order to get things like Ronaldo and people like that from South America and Africa and Asia to get into access to the clubs, and why this is good from representation, etc. So you can see the classic flow and arguments that come from fans impair survivability. Obviously, the incentive structure here is why fans actually would. Here, you'd have to have reasoning to why fans are irrational. They're likely to not care too much about the long term. They're likely misinformed or uninformed. They may just have divergent incentives. A piece of weighing here is just why, even if they have good incentives, their incentives are diverse and ever changing, which means you can never predict what they want. The predictability is the only thing you need for the access to that impact on survivability. Other arguments you could have run. So things about splintering, you could have just argued or developed an argument a bit further to why what's uniquely bad about the democratic model is just democracy, as in it splinters among different types of votes. You have apathy within a certain type of voters. So think about what type of voters will be more likely to participate in the democratic model, as in would actually turn out to referenda. Those are probably most effortly engaged. Those are the hardest core sports fans. And what kind of things they would want from their sports club? Are they going to want their best? Are they going to want the best financial actor? Or are they going to want the short-term juicy yield like some football fans want, right? Here you can think about things like boycotts, as in if you have a democratic model and people vote for X but don't get X, they get Y, they get pissy, but now they don't have the accountability, they don't have like insulated accountability. Like the way in which they take their backlash out is just to use democracy to undermine the freedom of that financial actor in a way that fucks over everybody. And maybe just detract, the broader impact here is it just detracts from the joy of the game, right? Maybe the reason you shouldn't give these people power is they will just focus on the fact they have power rather than focusing on the fact they enjoy the game. Here you can have framing about why you can still have significant accountability for professional actors when you have collective action outside of democracy. How things like boycotts can still exist on the opposition side to change the worst practices, as in really corrupt and bad football managers. Like think about in Newcastle United's example, it's the Mike Ashley bastard who was decimated the viability of Newcastle United for a long time, and how fans eventually got so fed up they just boycotted the game, which plunged the financial action. They also just deliberately boycotted the other industries that Mike Ashley were involved in, things like Sports Direct, and there was massive social media campaigns to such an extent that his financial assets were so hit that it changed. It maybe, I don't know if it truly did, but you can argue in a debate it changed its incentive structures to the point at which he sold out to the Saudi Arabian investment core. Whether or not you think that's a good thing, I don't know. But Newcastle United is doing very well recently, which suggests that money actually is important for the joy of the game. Here you could just finally and thirdly expand the argument to there being better alternatives, as in things like there are better alternatives to corruption. Things like when you don't have democracy, you can have external accountability that is needed because there is no other accountability mechanism, i.e. democracy creates a mission accomplished phenomenon whereby you don't push for external accountability. In actual fact, you want to delegitimize external accountability because it undermines your own democratic power, because it seems to rob you of your decisions, it seems to undermine your authority as a sole agent to make those decisions. Therefore, not having democracy is actually a good thing, because other financial actors have to step in order to regulate the system better, and things like equality and corruption could be better from that. So, once again, I think the argument from opposition might be just more intuitively about economics, but there's a lot of ways you can turn that analysis into things that aren't economics, things like I did about the enjoyment of the game, joys of the game that come from collective action or having splintering in groups, and just implicit harms of democracy, as you would expect from me. The last thing I will say is that it's always important not to forget the comparative, as in with all of that analysis, and most of the times I wasn't doing this, so you should take what I just did as not the full thing you should do. Also be comparative, right? You also want to explain why the survivability of clubs is actually quite high, or is significantly better when you just have professional actors, as in why are good professional actors getting in as well, rather than just arguing why on the Gov side you get bad financial actors. I don't think this is necessarily should be true, because theoretically by proving Gov is worse than Op, you are proving the comparative. But I've had some judges sometimes tell me, and I don't know if I've been told any, but I've heard this many times from some judges, that they want you to also prove a positive on your side, as in you don't want to have a negative comparative, you want to have a positive comparative. I think having any comparative is sufficient, but there is a diversity of judges out there. Be careful and also just make your comparative argumentation here about why professionalism is good as well as Gov being bad. So those are some arguments you could run for an opening opposition. What about closing government? So here you could be more, you can either go deeper into the value of democracy, or you go specific into sub-impacting of opening government. It's probably the two strategies that are most obvious, the third one also being weighing, are the three things that I think are most useful in general sports debates, but also those where in this type of debate there is a lot of material and quite persuasive material that can come out on top of. So it's unlikely you're going to find a uniquely positive, like a uniquely very different angle that comes up. So digging deeper rather than jumping to another landscape is probably the way in which you not should, because you can do anything you want, maybe the way to maximize success from my perspective. So here are 4 ideas you could have run in closing government. The first is just arguing, other than democracy being good for representation, you go a step before that and argue, if open government had missed this, why democracy is actually just instrumental in and of itself for being able to be aware of your own preferences. Like when you have the power of democracy, like you think of yourself as you are, should be as a voter, when you have the power of voting, whether or not you even use that power, you reflect on how you would use that power. And by doing that, you think about what things you actually want, which may be an actual important question for people to know what they want from their football club and what they want from their individuals. This may just make them more accountable actors, but may just make them more self-reflective about what they actually want from their club, such that they could access some degree of accountability mechanisms, some clubs, some community support about changing their club for the better. This might just be instrumental not just for the benefits of sports, as in maybe they just enjoy the game more when they actually know what they want and know what they're looking for and they want, as in they become more invested in their club, which means maybe they just feel the highs more. But it might be secondarily beneficial just that preferences, knowing what you want is a good in and of itself, because it means you become more aware of who you are, which maybe makes you a better person and feels better about yourself, independent of sports. That's one thing you could have done. The second is you could have done a specific exemplification and extension. So you could have said, okay, maybe the democratic model from that open opposition pushes is bad for making worse financial actors, but, and here's where you engage in what a bad financial actor means, is maybe in closing government you're like, yes, we get financial actors that are poorer, maybe financial actors that aren't the most, maybe you just have to say financial actors that aren't the most wealthy, but the most wealthy actors are actually the worst actors. Here you could use some degree of specs about the influence of dark money on foreign politics, as in how professional UK sports clubs are often in major leagues funded by those that are trying to whitewash what they're doing in foreign countries. Things like the Saudi Investment Fund that are instrumentalizing Newcastle. You can see I come from Newcastle with all the examples I'm using. Newcastle United in order to paint a better image of the Saudi Investment Fund in general, rather than just an investment fund that is also linked to supporting aspects of terrorism around the world, and also just all of some illiberal stuff that Saudi Arabia are doing, right? Actually, Saudi Arabia are doing this quite extensively with things like even funding boxing, where they're significantly outcompeting the vast majority of the world in funding international boxing rings. Things like AJ versus Ngannou for some reason, but also just the major international WBO and other types of boxing are going to Saudi Arabia as a result of their ability to influence the interests of boxing fans through money. Just throw so much money out there that it makes individuals forget and have positive appeal to Saudi Arabia, which can be beneficial, economically to Saudi Arabia, but it change the perspective people have. And you can make an argumentation to why maybe the most important thing in this motion, almost actually in this argument, you are stepping out of the realms of the landscape of the rest of the debate, about why accountability to these bad actors on an IR perspective is actually the most important thing. Here you'd have to do a lot of framing to why not much changes in the debate. Like maybe people become wealthier or poorer, but you'd have to wash why you don't know whether you have to break the link about whether or not that actually becomes more or less important. The piece of framing that you can use here, although it works, I found it works on some judges, but it doesn't work on others, is to try to marginalize how much money is actually changing, and to say that, and often teams won't do this because it's a hard thing to do, you don't actually know how much more $1 extra into your football club actually makes you happier. That thing is very unclear. So if you're able to mitigate the amount of money that's changing on either of the top half teams, you can wash money out of the debate. Secondarily, you'd have to wash representation out of the debate to a certain extent, as in you might have to argue that representation could be good in certain instances, as in empowerment, but bad in other instances, as opening opposition talked about in terms of detractment. The piece of framing here would be like these two things happen to the same level and have the same certainty about them, so they cancel each other out. Here we have an independent impact that is probably more certain to exist, and this is probably a thing that requires more significant and more intricate tracking and weighing if you want to run and be successful in this dark money argument. Or, as I keep saying, if you just want to run the argument because you find it fun, that's an argument you could have run. The third thing you could have done is just sub-impacting. So local development is an often slightly overused, but argument that it seems to track and appeal quite well to a wide variety of judges. As in, democratic model would have been good because maybe you could have extracted certain types of terms and conditions from your financial actor, which includes X, and then just argue why X is good. In this case, X could be you extract concessions that you'd have developed your area, you'd put some reserves of the money that they're investing in the club will be kept to developing local areas like providing sports equipment, providing youth clubs, providing some coaching to individuals. Here you can have to obviously use the metric of intercompetition, why obviously in very small league clubs you're not going to have a lot of financial actors potentially intercompeting with you. But in certain larger, medium to larger clubs, maybe you do have a lot of financial actors that are competing for that financial asset because it has high visibility, etc. So you have some leverage over controlling the conditions and merits. Obviously, you have to frame quite carefully why there's not things like cartels that form, as in they extract. You know what I mean? Maybe you don't know what I mean. Maybe you want to probably have a burden of argumentation to why large financial actors actually won't unify around one type of contract condition, i.e. they want to minimize the amount of money they put into X. You have to give at least some leverage. Here, I think the info slide gives you that leverage, which is that you're not going to let go of your prior financial actor until your new financial actor. But these could be the coups. Anyway, this is a clash of the debate. The last thing you could have done, and there's obviously other things like local development, could have been things like just making the club and environment safer. That could be one condition you try to use for your accountability. This is good because it brings more kids to the game, people are safer, feel happier in the game, come more likely, which increases funding, etc. Or you can like boycott certain types of sponsors, which is a unique form of representation because advertisement is uniquely coercive. So you can see those are three examples, kind of stock of sub-impacts that you could extract from contract concessions. The last thing you could just be weighing. So this is an underutilized extension metric, as in extension speakers don't necessarily need to have a new impact and don't necessarily need to provide like a whole new layer of comparative analysis. An extension could theoretically just be weighing things that are unweighed in the debate. So providing comparative justifications to why one thing that opening opposition has proven to be important is not as important, proven to be true and exists in the world, and to some extent important, is not as important as something that opening government has proven to be true but hasn't explained why it's important. So for instance, you can imagine in most mid rooms, top half seems to be like, we get more representation. Cool. Opening opposition might be like, we make clubs survive longer. Cool. That's the end of top half. You could just, in closing argument, explain why representation is more important than survivability of clubs, and explain to the judge. You might have to just tell the judge this, because some judges don't think like this. You needed this piece of weighing in order for you to more clearly see why opening government is winning. Obviously, provide a list. Don't just say it. Provide a list of reasons why representation does actually matter more than clubs. And you look at the weighing video if you don't know how to weigh. That could have been something you could have done and might have been quite successful. And some judges would appreciate that because it makes the top half clearer if you do it well. Cool. What about closing opposition? My face is in the way. Wonderful. So, some ideas on closing opposition. So first, you might have argued that actually what the democratic model is. So the first thing could have been accountability, which is probably a key clash in terms of financial actors. The reason I think this is a worthy thing to consider as an extension is I think a lot of the material from opening opposition depends on quite nuanced reasoning to why accountability is the way in which it has to be for opening opposition. And there's a lot of extra analysis that could be given here. And you might want to consider this as an extension. So for instance, you could have been like, why actually would you have more power over a professional actor? Because that thing isn't actually that intuitive. Like I talked earlier about things like collective action, being able to unify around one common problem, and I gave Mike Ashley as an example. That took a long time, and it's kind of, I even confessed to myself that it's quite suspect if that was actually true. So you might want to think about just not accountability in the sense of getting the end result, but why it increases scrutiny on professional actors, why it means that individuals want to know more about what they're doing and make an effort to pool their social media resources, their investigative efforts, why local journals, like in the Newcastle example would be the local Chronicle, put more of an emphasis in trying to question, tease apart, and therefore have a degree of prior accountability to these professional clubs. That can be actually quite useful for activating the accountability mechanisms that might already exist, right? You need to see smoke to know there's a fire. Whilst we want to put the fire out, we need smoke first, right? And it might be the case that within a democratic model, because what the local newspapers would be doing would be undermining the choices and decisions that the people themselves have made, and they are obviously their clientele and their buyer base that would buy the local newspaper, etc. You don't want to make an enemy of the people who are paying you money, which is the reason probably why in the democratic model this type of scrutiny wouldn't manifest, but in the professional model it would. You can follow this analysis through to why this might be a better version of the accountability mechanization from opening opposition. And here you can just have, it says weaponized collective action claims on Gov about, and I don't know what the next word is, but whatever that word is, do it. The second way could just be things like instability. Here just other exemplifications of why democracy might be bad, and things like you have like rapid electoral turnover. So maybe what the consistency of the message that financial actors are receiving doesn't change. It changes too rapidly. So rather than having a generic idea of unpredictability that opening opposition could argue, in closing opposition you could uniquely argue it's not necessarily unpredictability, but it's like rapid changes that mean, okay, oftentimes financial actors can cost in unpredictability, but massive amounts of unpredictability they find difficult to cost in. And that means that things like rapid electoral turnovers, as in when lots of people die and new people turn up, or when there's a massive movement in the electoral incentives, as in a big news story breaks about how this one club is doing shit things, which changes the incentives of all of the other democratic clubs, and now they want something completely different, so they pressurize the company, and they threaten to sell that company now as a result of not liking some irrational rumor about that actor that's currently owning the club. How that can perform a unique type of instability. Here you can argue why instability is the worst thing because it damages all other impacts in the debate. As in, and this is an argument I love making, is that representation is not just good because representation is good, right? Representation is only good if it reflects the actual values you hold as an actor, whereas sometimes giving people power means they end up representing the wrong version of themselves. As in, if you give people misinformation and allowing them to vote, that is not an actual form of representation. That is a form of allowing them to be unrepresentative of themselves. It's probably morally equivalent to having a totalitarian state where it doesn't deprive them of the vote themselves. So you can think about why representation is only important insofar as people are actually accessing their preferences, voting on their preferences, and actualizing what they want to happen. The second intuition here is, whilst it might be good to vote, like you have at party A or party B, and allowing you to vote might seem good, but if I tell you that party A wants to do party B stuff and party B wants to do party A stuff, and therefore you vote for party A rather than B. The reason you do that is because you thought you wanted party B's stuff, not A's, if that makes sense. That suggests that things like instability, as in irrationality, misinformation that might spread between, like, you can imagine how a financial actor might try to misinform the Democratic electorate in order to vote for them, even though they wouldn't actually do the good stuff they wanted. Here you can access accountability prior arguments in the first argument to really nail home why representation isn't good in this debate, why it's unlikely because of the power asymmetries, especially in football clubs that have maybe limited external accountability in terms of information treads, why actually it just becomes significantly less representative. And here the overall strategy, at least the perspective I have of closing opposition, is more about not just taking a new impact, but flipping the best version of impacts that have come before you, as in representation. I think it's quite a strong impact in this round. You can see how that is a quite compelling closing opposition argument to why representation actually gets worse. It's precisely because the mechanisms of accountability government would have argued. So that's what you could have argued in this debate. Quite a fun debate yet again. So 2 good rounds. Shame I didn't go to this comp. So, right, round 3. Here we go. We're in the top room. What we're going to do. So, this House, as a young Republican senator, would formally endorse Donald Trump for president. You're a 39-year-old, which apparently is young. I like the fact that whoever wrote that thinks 39 is young. This Republican senator from a deeply Republican state. Although even if you're in a deeply Republican state, you're broadly center-right, and you have gained a reputation for good bipartisan work. You are seen as a rising star in the Republican Party. So, obvious things to point out before we talk about arguments. This is an actor's motion. We want to make our argumentation about the incentives of a young Republican senator, as in a 39-year-old who is center-right, who has done a lot of bipartisanship before, and presumably is now aware of the fact they're a rising star. Maybe people are talking about them as a future vice president, president, whatever. Cool. And now we're talking about formally endorsing. So there's a distinction here in the motion between endorsing and formally endorsing, which means you can become a little bit more creative about what you think formally endorsing means. This is why looking specifically at the words in the motion are very important here, about finding the nuance of the arguments and not being outframed by a back-off team. Cool. So what arguments could you run in opening government? 2 quite obvious arguments that I don't think just because they're obvious shouldn't be run. It's the first that maybe what this Republican senator cares most about is their future career. Here you'd have to argue that endorsing Trump, particularly within the local electorate you have, which is quite deeply Republican, is 1, the way in which you're going to get promoted, as in the way in which maybe the senator will access mechanisms of power, will be able to, not disenfranchising their current voter base, but allowing their voter base to empower them up the GOP. You can think of intuitive reasons why this is true, right? Like, in order for you to climb ranks, you have people who don't want you to climb those ranks. Those individuals will try to tear your base apart from you in order to get them. If you have a consistently solid base now, it is preferable to ferment and solidify that base and not fuck them off, which is likely to happen because they're probably MAGA supporters anyway, because it's a quite Republican state. You can think of reasons why that is true, as in Trump uniquely appeals to a positive message that is quite simplistic. And I don't want to say that red states, anyway, I'm not going to say what I just said. I'm not going to say what I was going to say. You can think about all of the reasons why this actually would be good for his future career prospects. Here, the analysis I gave specifically to illustrate the fact that you can prove this argument without having to prove that Trump will become president in the first place. So you don't want on government bench to have to accept the burden that the impacts that flow from you will only flow if he becomes president, because you don't want to have to prove more than you need to prove in order to win the debate, because that provides more attack angles for your opposition side. Also means you're more likely to have a hole in your analysis, etc., etc. You know, I've said this so many times now, so hopefully you've watched some of these videos. I mean, if you got to round 3 in this 1 hour and 1 minute video, you probably know I've said this before. Thus, you want to rely upon analysis that is predicated on the most likely like the most status quo shit, as in he isn't president, he lost the election, somebody else won, he's disgraced, whatever. Well, maybe not disgraced, because that's unlikely to happen. He's still going to have a lot of support within the certain subsects of the GOP. So here you just argue that Trump, even if he loses, will still control a large perspective of the GOP image, particularly in the voters that I've just characterized as your base. And that means, and also this will expand for generations, thinking here about intergenerational argumentation, i.e. why the parents will sit their kids down or grandparents will sit their kids down and explain why they thought Trump would have been a good president, why you were there on the stage with them, why Trump invited you on the stage because he probably has a limited number of individuals that are appealing to him. He also, during the primary season, he probably looks to local supporters, the Republican senators quite high up and within his state, probably is able to have a massive amount of name recognition. Trump probably wants some degree of support within states because he knows that if he is elected, he needs to have Republican backing in order to get his legislation through, which is the reason why he will listen to you and want you on the stage in the first place and gain a degree of support, even if he doesn't win because he thinks he's going to win, or he wants to hedge that if he wins, he has support. Last, you want to maximize the approval amongst these generations. This is important because this means they will elect you again. Obviously, the opposition push could be you're a Republican, you're going to get elected anyway. But Republican senators often have faced primaries, even in very Republican states, where they're trying to be outflanked by the most MAGA individuals and the most people that are die hard into the MAGA image. Here you could frame that you don't want to be dethroned and therefore have your future career destroyed because you allowed the more right version of yourself that gave into the unique message of being a Donald Trump supporter when you didn't. As in, there's always going to be people that are going to play politics and see if you don't formally endorse, somebody else who was going to be a competitor will formally endorse, which is the reason why you probably will lose if you don't do this. This piece of framing is probably quite important in order to secure the basic impact of government bench that your position right now is good, which is what the info slide says. You want to keep at least your good position now, and this is the only way you can do it on government side. That's probably what I could say about future career prospects. You could be inventive and say, well, you might want to make opposition bench work, right? Just because it's higher burden to say Trump's going to win. By providing 3-4 reasons why Trump is likely to win, you at least have to make opening opposition and closing opposition work to disprove you, which can be instrumentally useful. It also means that you can lock out closing government from that version of a higher impact argument. So you can say, Trump is likely to win. Here's a high approval rating. Biden doesn't know how to speak. If Biden gets replaced as internal fracturing, Trump is already likely to be a unified figure. He's already bought into a propaganda image that has unified his base. Base unification is important. Trump has a lot of wealthy access, blah, 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 blah. All of that stuff about why Trump is likely to be president. Here you can just argue that means maybe you don't become vice president, but you at least massively increase your margin that you're going to get a cabinet position, be favored by Trump, and therefore get access to lobbying funds once Trump is president, being able to have a greater media image to build your name, and therefore more likely to become president in all future careers, and endear yourself to the GOP, particularly because Donald Trump will likely, if he gets into positions of president, solidify his base on the GOP, and therefore consistently replace aspects of the GOP structure with Trump supportists, which is likely people you would meet if you formally endorsed Trump and Trump liked you. And this is good for the interpersonal connections you have with them, means that they are more likely to support you because you know they support them, etc., etc. Future career prospects, probably a good argument to make in this round. In terms of revealed preference, you could just argue, not independently, but additionally, that you kind of know that if you're elected in a deep red state, you chose a deep red state either because you're just Machiavellian and that's where you'd get most elected, but it's likely that these senators don't just come out of nowhere, right? The GOP usually picks individuals that resonate with that characteristic or county more. Maybe you were born in that state. Maybe you were very much aligned to Republican ideals in a red state. And the reason you could, other than that, what I just said is, in order to get elected in this place, you have to talk to them as if and make them see as if you're one of them. And maybe that just means you are one of them, right? Maybe you were born in a deep red state, which means you bought the Kool-Aid, right? You're more likely maybe to buy into the Donald Trump messaging. Maybe if you didn't originally, you said it so much in order to persuade Trump's face to vote for you in 2022 that you just fuck it, maybe it is true, maybe the election was stolen, etc. Maybe, well, this channel's not monetized. I wonder if an algorithm that's not going to demonetize me for all the shit I say in these motions. And that there's, etc. Here you'd have to weigh off about the idea of bipartisanship, as in, maybe you'd have to frame that bipartisanship and the reason you did that was due to a compromise because you're in a minority position, or because they were in a minority position. It doesn't actually reflect your most important preference. It just reflects a Machiavellian instinct of something you did. Here you don't want the argumentation coming out on opposition bench that center-right means you're not a MAGA person. Because obviously the reason the CA's put that in the info slide is because if they didn't do that, then the op in this debate would be much harder. So here you don't want to completely dismiss it, but you may want to make your opposition bench work a bit harder by framing what center-right actually means and why, even if initially you were moderate, You bought the Kool-Aid. That could be a clever argument you could make to frame out and at the very least make opposition bench have to work a hell of a lot harder to take a first or a second. Cool. Let's have a look at opening opposition then. So opening opposition. Two probably broad arguments you can make. The first is that you could just go full guns on the two burdens by saying, okay, Trump is unlikely to win, or at the very least, when he tries to become president again, he's going to evaporate a lot of the positive influence he has in the future, particularly to a certain type of sub-actor. So here the opening opposition retort could be on the stakeholders the actor ought to care about. So government side arguments is probably like MAGA voters and maybe some very marginal MAGA financial actors. They probably mainly care about Trump's appeal rather than your appeal. Whereas in opening opposition, you could argue, okay, maybe you're going to lose some of the MAGA supporters if you don't formally endorse, but remember that formally endorsing does not mean formally rejecting. It could just mean not saying anything. Maybe like just saying one thing to one person, one thing to another person. Obviously, you don't want to frame that so flippantly as I did, because closing government or DPM would go, well, people would eventually realize that you had an appeal to them, blah, 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 blah. And you know what I mean. And that people would call you out and there'd be contradictions because social media would be able to recognize everything you'd ever said, and you notice that you're saying one thing to one other person would undermine your position. However, you could be a bit smarter by saying, okay, maybe you're just going to take the bullet that MAGA people are going to hate you. A piece of interesting framing could here be that, Donald Trump is unlikely to become president. Donald Trump will blame people around him, just like he blamed like representatives and senators from Georgia for not actually doing the electoral meddling that he wanted to do, which meant you wouldn't be endeared to the MAGA voters anyway because you'd be blamed probably when Trump loses. So you want to prove that Trump is unlikely to win, as in his insanity, his criminal convictions, etc. We've had debates in the SSDC about that motion. Actually in Mace, which is the next one I'm going to record, unless I go to sleep. Instead, what you want to argue is a different sub-actor, which is that you want to endear yourself to the financial actors who are more likely not to be vociferously pro-Trump, and you can imagine why this is likely to be true, as in financial actors tend to become very powerful in positions of liberal circles. Liberal circles will tend to positively select for more liberal individuals for the same reason of the Kool-Aid example, as in if round circles more likely, even if you didn't originally believe them, it ends up becoming a reinforcing and positively reinforcing cycle that tends to move your position to other instincts. You can imagine how you receive social ostracization or just a perception of rejection if in a liberal circle in New York you're like, Trump is quite good, abortion is illegal, abortion is immoral, etc. All the positions Trump argues. And therefore you'd passively reinforce into the financial actors will passively reinforce into themselves why they are more liberal. Which means these people are probably looking for a more moderate candidate after Trump loses. In terms of your future career prospects, these are the people you need in order to fight off other competitors, because what matters is not maybe the brand messaging, but being able to get your messaging out there in the first place. Having packs that give you money is the way you get your messaging out there, because guess what? Advertisement costs money. The more you have, volume matters. And things like AI and stuff are expensive, and the more AI you have on social media, the more likely your messaging gets through to specific catering of voter bases, etc., etc. So, here in opening opposition, but like there are certain type of actors that are important. These actors are money people. Money people will not accept fewer money people are likely to accept me if I formally endorse Trump. I'm not going to formally endorse Trump because I'm going to get more money, and therefore my career prospects will be better, particularly because these lobbying influences likely lobby actors of the GOP that once Trump loses to be president, or even if Trump is president, he's not going to be president one day, and after Trump is not president, these GOP people will end up having to listen to the financial actors that pay for their re-election campaigns. Like even the Koch brothers can't fund everybody, so there's still a degree of left-wingism that has to be like. I'm not saying a left-wing person is going to pay for a GOP, but there's a spectrum, right? Like center-right activists can instead of funding the GOP, may fund other financial bodies, which means it's into competition, which is why they appeal to center-right stuff. Anyway, this is all the reasons why you want to cater to financial actors potentially. The second is maybe leaning into the part of the info slides about bipartisanship. Here you would want to express why this is a revealed preference, not for being a red state, as you might want to argue in opening government rather, but rather the fact you're just not MAGA, right? So if you're doing a lot of bipartisanship, it is likely that you respect, and particularly if you're center-right, you respect that there's a disagreement, but there's a realistic and viable alternative to the idea. As in, You are obviously convinced of your own position, but you don't delegitimize the other position on the other aisle. You recognize that there is probably a legitimate position to hold, even if you don't hold it. What that probably means is it's the revealed preference that you think that MAGAism, which is probably can be defined as a unitary approach to policy and a rejection of compromise, is not something that you want to place your career on. Here you can weigh why career success is important, but sorry, Teams just zoomed up on me. Career, I thought my supervisor was calling me. Career success is important not as a means in of itself, but as a means to an end. And that end is to favor the things that you think are important. The things that you think are important are probably your values. So if you compromise your values as an actor, it doesn't matter that you have power. And you can think about loads of the educational reasons to why the senator probably idealizes positions of power because they have a core message they think will resonate with the world, and also a message that they want to implement, as in they have faced adversity and their solution is something they feel conviction in, and bipartisanship is an expression of that conviction. If they compromise that, they're compromising their conviction, which is their purpose of going into power in the first place. So you can use quite a compelling piece of incentive actor analysis to why you shouldn't appeal to a MAGA person. The upshot of this is that in opening opposition, much like opening government, the clashes are very simple. Career prospects are important, but explaining what the actor cares about and why the actor cares about it is what is necessary, not just to win the debate, but to insulate yourself against a closing half team. So explaining either on government side why a young actor cares about MAGAism, or why in opening opposition they don't care about MAGAism, is key and is the thing that has to be focused on in this debate, in my opinion, from an opening team or any team to get the first. Or a good first, not like a 72 first. Cool. So let's have a look at closing government then. So there are a few argumentation you can run in closing government. So a lot of the ideas and extension in this debate are probably along three angles. So the first angle is probably sub-impacting at a lower burden the stuff that opening government has talked about. So you can imagine that a lot of opening government material may sound jazzy, but they actually might miss the burden of the argumentation. Things like future career prospects are quite an intuitive argumentation, and they may immediately jump for things like, you're not going to be president in 2028 or whatever. 2026, sorry, 8? Yeah, 2028. Without necessarily having the burdens, the analysis to back that burden. Here in closing government, you could just either try to prove that burden, or you could go for lower hanging fruit burdens. As in, you could argue, one, if you formally endorse Trump, it's likely you get your name in the paper, the local GOP that's likely to be aligned to MAGA, per the info slide, is likely to like the fact you've done this, put you in the local newspaper, invite you to talk, give you positive appeal and positive affections. All of this means you get more name recognition and more news out there. The reason this might be good is not just because people are going to vote for you anyway, but means that maybe both national and regional newspapers take you up, but people are just more aware of what you're doing, which is actually the prior consideration of actually people caring about what you do and giving you positive respect for what you do, right? A lot of politicians across the world do really good stuff most of the time, but people don't know about it because they don't get recognition for that. They don't get, people aren't aware and get information about what they're doing. If you formally endorse Trump, maybe you just, people are aware of what you're doing. They report on you more favorably, report on you more likely. They tell you about the good stuff you're doing in the community, especially if they don't like read political newspapers or political leaflets. They just put those shit in the bin. If you align yourself to good actors that people already trust, i.e. the people who want you to formally endorse Trump, and you can weigh why those people are likely to be power figures in particularly red communities, deep red states rather, then this is good because some attention is better than no attention. This could link to a lot of other aspects, as in maybe there's just positive campaign spending. If you formally endorse Trump, Trump is likely to like you. His organization, as in his campaign vehicle, may fund you a bit. Whilst it might not make a difference in your current electoral success because you're in a deep red state, more funding is better than less funding because it means you can entrench your position, maybe you can get more leaflets out there, you can do more campaign stops, which means you're more aware of individuals, you can connect with them more, maybe you understand the issues better, you find ways in which you can connect to people more, which makes you a more effective politician, which means your campaign success is likely higher in the future. Maybe it means you can use the money and prestige to go to other areas of the country, as in if you formally endorse Trump, Trump may be like, this guy's pretty good, you can argue reasons why that is likely, and maybe he takes you around the campaign stops, you go to neighboring states, like if you're Alabama, you go to Georgia and Tennessee and Indiana and Ohio. Aha, I see, I know American geography. And maybe this means you become more endearing to those types of voters in different states that are important when the GOP when your turn for the GOP primary comes. So Trump will eventually go as opening opposition, and everyone in the debate will probably recognize. If you endear yourself to Trump and you're ready to jump on the bandwagon to go to different areas around America, maybe this improves your electoral chances at the primaries, meaning that you can be more likely to go through Super Tuesday actually being successful and gaining momentum, which is important in order to win the primary for both GOP and the DNC. Maybe this is good. Other argumentation you could have run, there's quite a lot here. So you could play like a really good responsive challenge. I think could come out, probably would have to come out, you should think about an opening government. Something that opening government might miss, which I think is quite good a response. Formally endorse, like, people have short memories, right? Like, I'm trying to think of a good example politically. I can't think of the example as good because I like reading about this stuff. But it's like, like, some people in the GOP don't realize that, like, what's his name? Oh, the New Jersey governor. Chris Christie is actually like a really bad politician. Yet he was able, I mean, he didn't obviously get anywhere near the support necessary, but sort of like people forgot to talk about how bad of a governor he was. And then he ran for president 2 times afterwards, and that question never raised up. You can think of all the other reasons, like, I mean, Clinton did get a lot of shit, actually. I'm trying to think of a good example of like anyway, you get what I mean. What that means, you can really just play turncoat, right? Maybe you can formally endorse him now, but then not formally endorse him later. Or like dissociate yourself if he loses later, right? So you can play both groups off against each other by saying, okay, I endear myself to the MAGA people. I access all the impacts I just talked about, which is making connections, people relating to me personally, knowing what they want so I can appeal to them better when I become president. But then you just be a politician and be like, well, my campaign success will be greater because I can just, when he loses, go, well, he's a loser. Or when he wins, like, he was a great president, but it's time for a different president now in the future, which might just not trade off anything. So he can have a responsive challenge about, obviously there are trade-offs in the debate, but you can use this as a responsive challenge to get away from some opening opposition material about the harms by saying you can play both off against each other. So I think it's a good piece of framing you could use from closing to marginalize more significantly opening opposition than opening government had done. Other ideas, things like lobbying buyouts. So you could argue that there's just opportunities for enrichments by being close to Trump, as in by being close to Trump you get more money. This is good not just for your own enrichment, but your own access to stuff I talked about. Yeah, and the last thing is just maybe, and this is quite like an out there argument, right? Let's say all of the material I talked about was mentioned by opening government to a certain extent. Imagine, your opening government speakers talk even faster than I do for 2 speeches, and they've turf burned the hell out of you in terms of campaign success. There are other arguments that can be run here. The one that came to my mind was the idea of physical threats, right? So you're in a deep red state with people who probably be not just really passionate about Trump, but vehemently passionate about Trump, right? They think Trump is their savior. There is messiahism about Trump in a large number of communities in America. Maybe your physical safety is at threat if you do not actually take the step to formally endorse him. Maybe you're more likely to be attacked. Maybe your family is more likely to be threatened, etc., which is not inconceivable within the current state of America, nor is there no exemplification even within the UK of this being the case, right? Like Joe Cox, for instance, an MP that was murdered as a result of a political position on Brexit. These are exemplifications of why you're the thing an actor, irrespective of their ideology, cares most about is their physical safety. So you can bring this idea within other actor debates about safety, personal protection being prior to everything, and actually use that as an argument for closing government. You could have used this in a really strong room, for instance, where you can't out-analyze campaign success for opening government. Or maybe opening opposition have convincingly won the clash and thought of something that we haven't talked about on things like funding and have weighed it really well. Physical threats could be a very compelling argument for running closing government and could carry the top, get the top, could like blindside the top half teams. So that's some arguments you could have run from closing government if you were so inclined. Opening opposition. So closing opposition. A few arguments maybe that you could have run. One is that maybe the first line of extensions could be types of analysis about undermining your future campaign viability or undermining your ability to do your career. Especially, I imagine top half teams will agree that's the metric. You might, in closing opposition, like I've said repeatedly, agree with the metric, but just find other ways to flip it. So one could be a broader reason to why actually the people that you need to vote for you in order to achieve your highest ambitions, especially as a bipartisan, i.e. the middle centrist voters, care most about democracy. and the viability of American democracy, which Trump, even if he doesn't become president, is likely to undermine. What this means is there's likely a large amount of pressure for you to conform to some aspects of the GOP who are the never Trumpers, who are likely to be there for a long time and likely to persistently point out all the things that Trump does bad, both in the campaign and if he becomes president. And here, maybe you just want to accept the short-term harms for the long-term payoff of not being disenfranchised and permanently associate with this idea. Here, you'd be challenging the idea of whether or not you could actually be a turncoat and giving some reasons to why you couldn't just turn on your heel. Like people who supported Trump, like DeSantis, people like that, don't do very well when they dissociate themselves from MAGA because they aren't ingratiated in the non-MAGA crowd anymore. They're seen as a third way where they piss off both of the main groups of individuals. So that's the one thing you could argue, one or two things you could argue here. Other ideas are like, if you don't endorse the person, So maybe if you don't endorse the individual, there isn't actually any hostility, right? So maybe you could have framing about why you are actually able to appeal to both groups if you don't do anything about it. As in, if you keep it nebulous and vague, like you make generalities about what you hope the presidential candidates do. You mention critiques in both and hopes in both. And here you can try to see how you can play off against both sides again, but in a slightly different way. The last is, and this is maybe a responsive challenge, here you could think about if opening opposition had convincingly beaten both top half teams with maybe all the stuff I've mentioned. A route to a second could be just explaining why Trump is likely to ignore you. Why Trump probably doesn't care about a young senator who's probably just started out in a deep Republican state that he's likely to win anyway, which means you're not actually going to gain any of the benefits opening and closing government, particularly the closing government benefits about localism being a route to nationalism. And then trying to weigh why you're only going to maintain harms and not benefits here. As in, you can imagine why the people will vote for you anyway. Maybe the turnout is lower in the red states. Whatever. So be it. But you've tarnished your future reputation, and Trump's not going to listen to you anyway, so you've tarnished any hope of future power. So here you can see a responsive challenge here. Once you can see, I think this is an example of a debate where there's a clear clash that is laterally gravitated to, and this is a type of motion that offers an opportunity for closing teams either to agree with the metric or to potentially struggle with a different metric. Here, I'd probably advise taking the same metric and doing slightly different and inventive things with it. I imagine, at least in my intuitions, and they are just intuitions, so feel free to reject them. That would be the best course of action here. Cool. Let's talk about round, I don't know what round we're on at, 4. Conditionality on aid. It's the practice of imposing restrictions on aid based on political, economic, or social conditions which a recipient country is required to fulfill. It's a fun IR econ motion to round 4. Let's have a look at some opening government material. So first could just be the idea of why having conditionality on aid restricts the amount of aid that flows and why that is a bad thing. Things like relieving poverty and why if you don't relieve poverty, individuals are likely to buy into the radicalism that is meaning that these nations are developing in the first place. I.e., you can frame that a lot of the reasons that developing nations persist in being developing is because they don't have things like institutions, don't have things like a base of middle class to have liquidity. All of these things provide sow the seeds for radicalism where people become so dejected and apathetic, but also radicalized in their rejection of the state and rejection of the hopes that have existed for 40 years. And this is mainly fueled through things like poverty and physical desperation. How aid is able to relieve that and therefore relieve the worst excesses of the harms these countries have, which is a gateway to accessing all of the better benefits of things like institution buy-in, institutional build-up, private actors moving in to make the country more developed and therefore have a sustained amount of growth and a sustained amount of wealth that doesn't require the whims of aid in the first place. Here you could access things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, i.e. there are obviously a lot of needs that are important. The spirit of putting aids on things in order to achieve higher benefits like liberty, inclusion are good, but there are more important things that come prior to that, things like being able to eat, having sanitation, not dying from disease, not thinking the radicals have the answers, etc. And institution building comes from that. I think the other argumentation that would be probably recommended to run from opening government probably things like weighing short-term harms against long-term benefits. So it is likely that there is a lot of short-term harms from not having conditionality, as in maybe some of the bad actors get money and they get more empowered. Maybe financial institutions don't become good and are empowered in a bad way because they take a lot of money and able to exact and persist the harms. Here, the key of opening government is to weigh preemptively against these. So you're not going to be able to rebut either every single example or every single piece of analysis about what the harm is. What you have to do in opening government is to weigh why the harm that opposition bench will prove is either restricted to a specific term, as in it only occurs in the short term and eventually dissipates in the long run based on your analysis, or that the things you're talking about, i.e. poverty, are the most important. If you prove that poverty becomes better, people become less poor, and poverty is the gateway to every impact, and poverty matters most, from opening government, you probably take the first. From opening opposition. Here, this is starting to exemplify some of the arguments about why opening government need to weigh, but even with weighing, there's a lot of things that opening opposition can do here. The first is maybe explaining, as I said, the aid without conditionality would be captured, and this would empower bad actors. These bad actors would mean that the aid doesn't actually instrumentally make people less poor. It maybe is funneled to really powerful actors, or funneled in a way that means that poor actors are persistently poor in ways that cause infighting. As you can imagine, that bad actors, i.e. those that gain power from having people desperate and disempowered, will want to use the aid if it's unconditionalized, which means they're able to do anything they want with it, theoretically, in order to instantiate that position, or in a more favorable view of opening government, to allow people to remove themselves from poverty, but nevertheless to create institutions that enfranchise their power in ways that you could weigh are uniquely more harmful. Here you're directly responding to the Maslow hierarchy of needs by just rejecting it, and claiming that whilst there are primary, secondary, and tertiary needs, that doesn't necessarily mean that primary needs are more important than tertiary needs. Here you can express the idea that on every single level, having these needs rejected is a harm, but if you are relieved of poverty, the harms of the secondary and tertiary not only threaten for you to return to the primary, but are actually more likely to relate to things like radicalism, are more likely to relate to things like disempowerment and negativity, and also an empowered state is more able to do harm than a disempowered state. As in, a state that has limited resources, they can't buy as many weapons, can't have as effective surveillance system, is unable to crack down on agency as much as possible, is unable to prevent smuggling for you to access some food, whereas a empowered state that has a greater capacity of police force, a greater access to crackdown, a greater degree of totalitarian oppression, it's actually worse, because you can argue that tertiary needs like agency and freedom and creativity, etc., are more fundamental to the quality of existence than food. Like, yeah, you will die without food, but life is not worth living if you're not able to be yourself. That kind of rhetorical, but you know what I mean. That kind of stuff. The second could be, as I said, the distribution might become unequal in the way in which conditionality would prevent that. Here you have to be comparative to why conditionality would be on opposition side smart and effective, which makes it slightly harder on opposition bench, I think, in this debate, because you can imagine why developed countries don't always have the most access to information, don't have the most perfect incentives themselves, and maybe want to empower some actors more than other actors. So you have to be very careful in opening opposition to either accept that that developed actors have pernicious incentives, or just argue why they may be bad in some aspects, i.e. they're misinformed or they're directly hostile to stability, why nevertheless those actors aren't as bad as the empowering all bad actors. Here the piece of analysis could be developed nations intercompete against each other for aid. Even with conditionality, they at least have empower a diversity of more positive actors than an abundance of negative actors, which means that actually on net you get empowerment of better actors. That's something you could argue, but something you definitely need to think about in terms of the ways you have different types of actors, right? You don't just have the incentives of developing nations and people within developing nations. You have the incentive of developed ones and the consequences of developed ones. Here, a last argument you could potentially make is the incentives of lenders themselves. So aid is not a given. States often go through periods of austerity, crisis, or redistribution of money, whereby aid is something that is usually very highly scrutinized and criticized. If aid is being given unconditionally, it's likely going to empower some actors that the state didn't want to empower, and this may make the state unlikely to lend at all or massively restrict lending, which means you can weigh in opening opposition. Yes, relieving poverty is good. We get some as well. Maybe it isn't as much as opening government, but at least we sustain that development of aid, and therefore sustain that level of decreased poverty, which means on net, after 50 years, we get less poverty than you do. We get more institution building than you do. We get more female empowerment or progressive policies than you do as a result of this. Here you're weighing why sustained aid matters more than single aid, as in it's just a large cash injection, but then pulled out as a result of empowerment of bad actors the states didn't want in the first place. Here you obviously have to bear in mind that here you could weaponize the idea that there's political swings, which means even if some governments were able to accept that they wanted to be unconditional and they were happy with the trade-off, there are future actors that won't. Maybe they will want on opposition side to change the conditions, but they nevertheless don't want to change what they are doing with the fact they are given money in the first place, which is more likely to be rejected when on opposition or government side you just don't have conditionality of loans. So it can be instrumentally useful to have conditions in order to have persistent aid. What about closing government? So in closing government, you could argue that conditionality is a bad thing because different countries impose different conditions, which means actually the conditionality that opposition bench may want, i.e. getting bad actors out, doesn't work, because what conditionality does is allows some bad actors to be empowered by some developed states, but not other, and etc. You know what I mean? Like China is going to fund the actor the West doesn't want to fund, and the West will fund the actor that China doesn't want to fund. What this means is a responsive challenge. Firstly, it's a responsive challenge to the idea of not having bad actors empowered, to having, as I just said, from opening opposition. But secondarily, it potentially, if you oppose conditionality, and therefore, if you don't oppose, I'm getting confused now. So if you oppose conditionality, the reason conditionality might be a bad thing is it means that good actors impose too many conditions, which means their money doesn't get into the country, which means it doesn't create leverage, because if you're funding a certain type of actor, the actor will become more dependent upon you for future aid, oftentimes because it's just liquidate. It's like it's smooth. That's a weird piece of analysis. Like the intuition that comes to me is like the reason Tesco makes meal deals, even though they are lost leaders, is that they're leaders, right? It means that you're more likely to go to Tesco's for other shit, and that's how they get their profit. Same thing probably works with any financial transaction. Like banks do this all the time. They will pull out, like they will cast a line for you. They will lose a bit of bait, but they get you in, which is the reason why you want to oppose conditionalities, because countries will like, well, you know, the West is giving me money. I've got some money from China, but they can't give me any more money. I'm now going to go to the West. On opposition side, the West is like, well, I want you to liberalize your institutions. And they're like, well, I don't want to do that. And they're like, well, you're not going to get my money then. But on government side, they're like, well, we'll give you some money. Maybe it's not going to be as much money as initially wanted, or initially we would have given you if you had conditions. Good. Which means it creates a dependency in a relationship between good. I mean, we presume the West means good. That isn't necessarily true, but you can think about why a diversity of actors is good, because a diversity of actors means that you have a degree of accountability that those states can have on those actors, right? So you take a very agnostic view, which is something I'd encourage you to do in debating, i.e. the West is not axiomatically good and China is not axiomatically bad. Although you can reason why either of those would be true. Having a diversity of actors, as in a country having a lot of actors, different types of financial actors to offer money from, means that that country has leverage over which actor it chooses, which means it's empowered in a way that is reparatory for the power it lost. Here you can frame how developing nations are not developing by accident. They remain in states of developing because developed nations became developed by depriving developing nations of their resources. And there is a reparatory obligation that the developed nations owe, which is the money back. And they have no reason to impose conditions, because guess what? Those people did not impose restricted conditions on the money that flowed out from developing to developed in the first place. Which is the second part of that argument, i.e. why it's a reparatory principle you can access by conditionality. I think the reparatory principle is quite a strong one in the debate, because it accesses the platonic perception of opposers' thoughts and emotions, which is why this thing should be good or bad in totality. The last thing, maybe just like, you might argue that maybe the conditions themselves, this is taking a higher burden responsive challenge, you might argue that maybe the conditions that opposition bench are opposing are good, as in, it seems quite intuitive that having females allowed to vote is good. It seems quite intuitive having accountability mechanisms about where you spend your money. It's quite good about saying, well, maybe you need to spend 60% of your money on actually buying grains and not AK-47s. Is good. But you can think about why the implementation, it might be actually bad, or at least worse than having no conditions. Because by having conditions, you probably waste a lot of money on accountability mechanisms, and that money probably could be better spent in other ways. As in, even if the conditions were good, the cost of imposing those conditions actually deprives from the good that money does in the first place. That's one example. The idea here, the example that came to me is the failures of Iraq, right? Like, you might think the invasion of Iraq was good in the sense that it tries to bestow democracy to Iraqis and allows representation, etc. But the implementation of that was bad, as in just the governor system that we implemented was poorly thought out, much like you can argue most conditions will be poorly thought out. They may be developed by a focus group, like make your press more accountable, or make your press more free, the Congo. And like the Congo's like, well, what the hell does that mean? What's the metrics of this? How do I do this? When I try to liberalize my media, I end up being monopolized by a few actors that are overwhelmingly powerful, which means not only now don't I have state control of media to be able to maybe be more effective in distributing positive information or balanced information, I now am beholden to financial actors that are even worse actors as a result. That's an example here, right? So the spirit of the conditions might be good, but the ability of nations and the ability of developed nations to think about what their conditions means is probably quite poor. And you can try to weigh using examples here why in most instances conditions would be a bad thing as opposed to just getting the fucking money on the ground in the first place. Here could be a good response to challenge to opening opposition. Cool. Let's think about closing opposition. Wow, an hour and 40 minutes already. In terms of closing opposition, you could argue a few things, hopefully, as in you would expect from most motions. First, you could argue that actually, if you impose restrictions, there may be a race to the top in the restrictions that are emerged. Like, here's the intuition here, right? What restrictions actually mean is you're empowering developed nations to get more for the money they give, and therefore developing nations have to do more to get that money. What this means is, because no developed nation may want to give free money, as in money with no ideological reverence or actual leverage to it. Like, for instance, you can imagine that some nations might impose conditions on the aid that are about like paying the aid back or creating institutions that financially benefit actors of their country so they get money back in other ways. As in, the aid could be, we will give you aid, but you will open your copper market only to this Chinese company. You think about why this produces a contagion that makes all actors race up in the types of things they want, as in the conditions that they are likely to impose will be reactive to the conditions other nations have imposed upon them. I.e., an example in the previous one, if the US now knows that China has imposed conditions upon Zimbabwe or South Africa's diamond mining to only sell them to South Africa, to only sell them to China, or to allow Chinese industries into those regions in the first, to have exclusive monopolistic power for certain regions, America might ask the same for them, as in either, okay, you're giving China direct control over this region in your country's mining, I want that region. What this means is maybe developing countries lose out even more sovereignty as a result of conditions because of the race to the bottom or top, whatever which one you want to think about it. Depends what perspective you take. And that means that developing nations are worse off. Here you can see you're starting to move away from the idea of poverty and to the other ideas of the metrics. But you can think about why poverty also factors into the debate, right? How the conditions... actually, that's an opposite. That's a government argument, isn't it? Okay, that's the government version of that argument. The opposition version of that argument is actually... You could make that the inverse, right? You can argue that conditions... there might be a game theoretical instance. Here's the perversion of debating: is I can immediately just be very convinced of the argument I just made, and then deliberately just flip it and convince myself the other way. You could argue that there's a game theoretical perspective, whereby maybe there is a race to the bottom in certain types of incentives, but also a race to the top in trading off conditions against each other. So in that scenario, what South Africa or Zimbabwe or other mineral-rich nations may be wanting is a type of actor that's willing not to want that concession from them. So you can see why actually this might be not just a contagion effect, but a gap in the market effect, whereby now you have a good developed nation that says, I can make inroads in the aid market, which now becomes probably a market, by offering only good conditions and not extractive conditions. Here, this actually accesses the reparatory duty better, right? Because what the conditions do is they allow for these nations to choose who has power over them, but allows for the market such that they produce good behavior in certain actors, even if there are few in number. I.e., you might have the Netherlands as like, okay, I don't want to do what America and China are doing and asking for your mineral rights. All I want to do is impose the condition that, I don't know, you have some accountability in your electoral system. This is the only thing I want from you. And this is more preferable for these nations than more extractions, which means now there's a race to the top in both respects for what type of conditionality is there. So you can think of the check and back mechanisms and why this actually might be good. Here you can see how you can make the argument work both ways. I just did that by accident. Think about why one matters more than the other. It's quite intuitive, but think about one is more likely than the other, or why one more matters more than the other. Others, it could be like the types of conditions. You could exemplify the type of conditions, as in maybe poverty is important, but as opening opposition I mentioned might have talked about. Talk about things like inclusivity is a metric that Western nations might impose upon each other, and why this is actually important, not just because inclusion is good, but it's actually important for stability in the ways in which that country manifests. So you can think about the ways maybe conditionality is good for tertiary aspects of Maslow's hierarchy, but it might also just be good in the sense that it creates a stable state, as in stability is an emergent property of having most needs satisfied, not just having one need satisfied, right? So it might be good to relieve poverty, but if you haven't satisfied the second and third part of secondary and tertiary modes of Maslow's hierarchy, yes, those are things that should be supported in themselves, as opening opposition might argue, but there are things that are instrumentally valuable to satisfy, because once that is satisfied, agents living in a state become better at managing that state, but also better at holding things accountable of that state, which means the state becomes better in a different angle. That's an example of how you can analyze the same start premise but get to different conclusions, right? So the analysis there was the same as opening opposition's analysis about why, as I said earlier, why it actually just means weighing why tertiary matters more than primary achievements of Maslow's hierarchy. But this could be an example of like that is important, but for another reason, and then weigh why the end outcome of that other reason, i.e. stability, is more important than just having that thing satisfied in the first place. The last could just be empowerment, as in you might reduce the power of bad actors and bad decisions, increasing representation. Here could be thanks to humanitarian intervention-esque ideology. In here, you're trying to weigh why the most likely conditions. So here, a lot of closing opposition could be just battling not just what conditions could exist, but the incentives for why one type of condition will be predominant in the conditionality of loans than others. Cool. So this is how you can think about this debate. A lot of it boils down not just to what the conditions are, but maybe a dynamic analysis for what conditionality actually means, both within a practical scenario, as in poverty relieving and other Maslow hierarchy needs, but also in the case of just like principled argumentation that I think is quite strong and can be made quite robust in this debate. Cool. The final of the SSDC ProAm 2024. This has hopes that the technology for immortality exists in the future. So, hopes motions. These are exceedingly rare, thank God, but they're quite new and they may become more popular after this video is recorded. The important thing to recognize about hopes is what you think a hopes motion is not what a hopes motion would be. So a hopes motion used to be government argues. So the hopes motion just used to be intuitive, right? So it used to be the case that the technology only exists on gov and op is status quo, right? and this technology never existed, the prerequisites for this technology never existed. We're just arguing about a prospective difference. However, what it's now become, because some people didn't like the outcome of the Zagreb final, is that there's argumentation about preconditions. So the thing you have to bear in mind here is that the precondition for having a technology of immortality exists on both sides. So opposition bench still have access to the idea that there is technology that the prerequisites of having technology to have immortality presumes we have a good awareness about disease, about the mechanisms of death, and at least have the knowledge to create this type of thing. What type of technology? That's important to bear in mind because preconditions become probably quite an annoying aspect of the meta in these motions, and you will have teams that try to tease apart the meta. By being aware in prep about what the meta burden is, as in preconditions, I maybe have not explained it very well. I would look at the judge manual, the more recent judge manual, or the most recent one, depending on how old this video is going to become when you first see it, to see how the idea of preconditions have changed. But they can make the debate radically different. Although I don't think they make it radically different for this one. So let's have a look at some government arguments you could have run in this final. The first is quite intuitive. Just because this technology exists doesn't mean that this technology is widely accessible. So this is an example of a prior burden before all impacts. So all impacts, well, most important impacts of Gov probably revolve around the idea of the technology being used by people for good, as in proof why immortality is a good thing for people to have, either because they get to live forever and that's good, or because they have agency and agency is the most important thing, or death is bad. All of this requires this technology to be widely accessible, which isn't presumed by the motion. The motion just presumes that the technology exists at some point in the future. So here you want to have analysis in open government, why the technology becomes accessible. This could be argumentation about why technology's costs gradually reduce as they become incrementally improved, i.e. the first computer was stupidly expensive and then the next computers iteratively become cheaper. As there is intercompetition in the market, people become more aware of how to produce the technology. There is micro improvements to the reduction of costs, why there'd be social pressures to have this reduced, why there'd be mass social discord if only rich people had access to this, why it might be state subsidized to a certain extent, i.e. why states might want to have immortal workers, etc., etc. Proving the burden that the technology becomes accessible makes you prior to everything that happens in government side. Prior doesn't necessarily mean you win the debate, but you can explain that nothing that closing government can argue, unless they add new mechanization to why things become accessible, can allow them to out-analyze you because they are requiring your analysis to access their impacts. So it is prior, and you can explain why prior is true, but you also have to explain why prior means the judges should vote on priority of analysis, which is route to impact. Other argumentation you could have run after you've proved accessibility is maybe like the technology. You might want to preempt argumentation for opposition bench about the coercion of this technology, as in the more accessible you make this technology, presumably the more pressure exists to use this technology. The example is the cheaper that the computers became, the more integrated they became with the economy, the more people needed to know how to use them to work, the less you're able to work not using a computer, therefore the more coercive technology came to change your mind. You can imagine how, unlike a computer, which actually is quite a coercive instrument in themselves, things like dopamine fixation, things like, retinal. I lost a. Anyway, I was going to start ranting about the fact that I lost a round at Euros when I first did Euros because someone said blue light damages your retina, and I didn't respond. Anyway, there's harms that can emancipate from computers. You can imagine quite intuitively why technology that literally prevents you from dying, i.e. prevents you from being able to have the most intimate choice to not experience anything ever again, presumably, or access heaven, which might be a fun closing government angle, is the most coercive thing. So you might want to be very careful and very strategic about arguing why this technology will remain optional. This is not an easy burden to satisfy, and there's not one that I can think of a really compelling reason why it is. There are some intuitions you can give to why this is a unique, insofar as people know how uniquely important this is. Maybe you have religious pressures, etc. i.e. you can draw analogies to things like euthanasia. Whilst euthanasia may become more and more accessible, it strikes me as counterintuitive to argue that just because it becomes accessible, people are forced to do euthanasia. because you can argue there is something very tabooish and something very respected about death, i.e. abortions and stuff like that are widely accessible in large parts of Europe, but people aren't as coerced to use them as the analogy of technology that I used earlier, right? So, and pushing those intuitions and why this aspect of life will become, life itself is something that's very much endeared and respected by society, and the choice over it is something that is very much, maybe that is the compelling, maybe I've just thought of it, is the reason why technology is always going to remain optional. I think you need this argument because the coercion argument for opposition is very compelling, if not challenged. So you need those two things to have a fighting chance of winning the final. Then there are two flow impacts from both of these more aspects of debating. One is just an explanation for why people ought to be able to have the choice in order not to live, so not to die. And this is argumentation to why either immortality is just good because you get to experience life and life is joyful, i.e. if you're immortal, presumably you don't get crippling diseases that kill you. Theoretically, you might actually get diseases that still make you feel suffering. Meh. You can play around with whether or not you think technology for immortality would demand such knowledge of diseases to prevent them from killing you. Whatever. Maybe be nice and generous to opposition. Maybe you still do get diseases, but you just don't die of them. It could be theoretically like everyone gets Alzheimer's. But you might want to, I think here you want to have to argue why technology for immortality gives sufficient intuitions. You have defenses against degeneration. As in, if you know how to be immortal, you probably know how to reverse the natural steady decline of bodies that exist because of entropy of biology. As in, things like Alzheimer's are a product of radical oxidative, here we go, let's not do a neuroscience lecture, are a product of your body no longer being able to repair itself, particularly in the brain. If we know how to make people immortal, it means we've been able to utilize the fact that there are mechanisms that can exist to allow the body to persistently regenerate itself like young people do. Things like telomeres and stuff. It's quite interesting to read about. Thus, probably we don't get as many diseases, and this is a good thing because you can just weigh about why diseases are a bad thing. This is the lower burden argument. The higher burden argument that secures the victory, in my opinion, is just to argue why even if life were bad, even if immortality is bad, giving people the option to consent into that is the thing that matters most in the debate. You can either argue from a state obligation incentives, as in we should hope for a world where the state is able to give the ultimate option for people to consent into the existence of that state. So obviously people argue that the massive idea of the state power principle, i.e. you can't choose to be born into a state, so the state owes you power. But reparatory obligations are only reparatory if they give you back the thing that was robbed to you. So we should hope for a world where the state is able to supplant or give you or provide the systems like economics and scientific education that provided the technology to give you the option to continue to consent into that state. So it's kind of like the mirror image of the argument to why the state should allow you to have euthanasia or should allow you to kill yourself. Because that's the way in which it gives you the option to opt out of the contract that even if you didn't sign, nevertheless exists by the virtue of what I just talked about. If you want to know a bit more about the state power principle and how to argue it more succinctly and more specialistly, look at Alistair's principle video. It's quite good. You can argue this, that therefore the state, we should hope for a world in which you have the technology, just like we have the technology to opt out of existence, we should also have the option to not opt out of existence, because that in itself is uniquely coercive. That's the kind of thing you probably want to argue from opening government, or at least I would have tried to argue from opening government if I was there. From opening opposition. Opening opposition. My brain just stopped working. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, sorry. Opening opposition. So there's some arguments you might want to run here. One, you probably want to argue, maybe you want to play around with preconditions. So if the technology for immortality exists, it probably means that we have a lot of knowledge about diseases and how to stop them from happening. Thus, the technology for immortality, as in that jump between dying now and never being able to die, is not as big as not being able to cure diseases versus not being able to die. So this gets out of some of the aspects government may argue about why this technology isn't good because it stops people getting diseases and people don't want diseases, we should want this technology. It washes that aspect out of the debate. Instead focuses uniquely on not the diseases per se, but just whether or not people should be whether or not people are allowed to live forever. The first thing after that is just to argue whether technology will be coercive. So this is the responsive challenge to the preference utilitarian argument. i.e. why this is not just a equally coercive choice, it isn't remedying a reparatory duty, which is the first part of that argument, but secondarily why it is coercive, it is additively coercive, so it's an additional coercion placed upon you. So the way you could argue that could be as follows. So you could argue the technology will become coercive because of financial pressures that may be placed upon you, but also just the inherent fear people have of death, right? Like, if you have a stressful situation in your life, like you have an exam, maybe you have social anxiety and you don't want to go out to meet the people that you know what I mean. If you don't know what I mean, then good for you, because that would be nice to have. If I then gave you the option to click a button that would prevent you from having to have that experience, and nothing bad would happen as a result, people would click that, right? People overwhelmingly would want to access this because they have a greater fear. People are irrational, right? They don't weigh off the long-term realities of being immortal, which may likely be an irreversible decision. If you're able to prove it's irreversible, people can't necessarily know what they want, and since prioritize their short-term over the long-term aren't actually representative of themselves, you probably satisfy the burden that technology is coercive, in the sense that the same way that drugs are coercive, right? I've never appealed to the argument that it's an argument of liberty to allow drugs to be fully legalized, as in to allow anyone to have access to heroin, right? The intuitive reason here is once someone takes heroin, even if it is their own agency, their addiction to that drug robs them of the agency you're seeking to satisfy, but even worse so, deprives them of the baseline agency they had beforehand, so it's a net negative form of agency. You can similarly argue that this technology is coercive, therefore a net negative version of the reparatory principle. Here, it probably defeats the principled argumentation from open government, and probably defeats the best government challenge, which is the idea of principled obligation to give people agency. Here you can weigh why agency is the most important thing in the debate. If you want to know how to do that, watch Tim Poolish's Advanced Principles, because I can't explain it any better than he can, because I'll just be explaining what he told all of us. You might want to also argue additionally and have a bit of fun, unless you find principles fun, then good for you. It's just why your immortality is awful. The classic 90 speaks Rumen idea is that life becomes devoid of meaning if there is no ultimate end. You have no push to do things, you have no urgency to do the things you don't like. I.e. in the analogy, you have to go and meet the people even though you don't want to, and then you eventually realize that people are nice and social anxiety is weird and you're glad you went out. I don't know about the drug analogy, maybe you're just happy you took drugs, you know what I mean. This might mean that things like meaning becomes lost, and meaning is the most important aspect to life. You can imagine how things like trade-offs are important. Like if you knew that you never had to make a trade-off in your life, like you could have everything. I could date everybody, I could have every experience. The value of that choice probably means so little to you that maybe you just pursue hedonism to immoral ends. Like you become, like you can imagine this idea of procrastination, but in a different sense, right? So some people procrastinate because they don't want to make the decision, but some people also would also procrastinate because they know that decision doesn't matter, or they think it doesn't matter either way what decision is bad. Here you can use that as an analogy to why that's just what most people's lives would become. Obviously, maybe some people would live their best life, but you can weigh why the vast majority of people wouldn't. And maybe if once you prove irreversibility, then you prove the infinite scale of that harm. And by scaling to the number of people affected by that, you automatically win the debate, because there's nothing that closing team could do to reverse that impact, because it's not temporal, it's infinite per the motion. The last could just be metaphysical angst, i.e. it's not I think it's quite an interesting argument to think about, to how this interacts with people's perceptions of the existence of an afterlife, or even the reality of there being an afterlife. Like, you can't know either side of the debate whether or not the afterlife exists. You can give some intuitions to why it must, or why it might likely to be, i.e. just the, I don't know, inconception. I don't know, there's like really fancy philosophy papers that don't make any sense to me yet, but if I ever understand them, I'll put them in the comment section. The idea that maybe some intuitions, if you have them, about why afterlife probably does exist, or at least why you should err on the side of caution, use Occam's, not Pablo's wager, what's the fucking thing called? Pascal's wager. You shouldn't, in the debate, presume the absence of something that is so infinite as an impact. As in, this is the Pascal's wager, for those that don't know, is that even if there isn't a God, you should act like there is a God, because the consequence of there being a God is far worse than the consequence of there not being a God. Because when you go to the pearly gates, if there's no God, you have no consequential harm. But if there is a God and you hadn't chosen to believe in them, it's an infinite consequential harm, which is hell. So probabilistically, you should always err on the side of maximizing the positive returns, which would be, in the debate meta, accepting that could be an afterlife because the harm of not accessing that, which is presumably infinite pleasure, per the conception of religion, is an infinite harm we've lost. On a lower level burden, you could just argue why it's metaphysically bad. Sorry, it's not metaphysically bad. That's the higher burden. Lower burden is just angsty. As in, imagine how religious people feel about this. Like, especially if the technology is coercive and they've robbed themselves and they feel as if forever they've deprived themselves of their divine God. Maybe this makes them existentially questioning how the power of God exists, whether God has forsaken them, etc., etc. Here you might want to weigh utility over preferences, i.e. why the utility in individual experiences matters far more than the preference they chose, either because, as I argued earlier, preferences don't actually matter when they're coerced, or preferences are only a means to satisfy utility, which is the tin Polish weighing. So, in closing, government, what can we do after the hopefully pretty high-class principles and utilitarian arguments have been swamped and stolen from you? You could do pieces of weighing. So there's likely multiple forms of coercion that can exist, and you can nuance them by arguing that there are some forms of coercion that are more important than are worse than other forms, right? Like the intuitions supporting this are like, you can think of coercion between the thing that you're coerced to do. Like if I coerce you to blink by threatening to punch you, this is obviously far less important than if I coerce you to shoot somebody, because the outcome of my coercion is far worse to you, which suggests that even if coercion is universally bad, I also intuitively as a person and as a judge will think about the outcome of coercion being worse. So here you can weigh the outcome of each of the coercions that may exist symmetrically, i.e. opening government, the coercion of not being the coercion of having to die versus the coercion of not being able to die, and explain why the coercion of having to die is more important because of the absence of experience, and why this is the worst harm than having bad experience, i.e. it's better to experience than to have no experience. The second you could argue is just cross-application to disease. Here you could argue a bit further that even if you had the preconditioned stuff from opening opposition, the unique thing about immortality is a unique form of degeneration and therefore a unique form of suffering. As in, the process of death, even if we had a cure to diseases, doesn't stop this latter stage of degeneration that some people argue is the most worst form of suffering, right? When your body is literally decomposing, when you're a cage inside your own mind, when your mental faculties are collapsing, when things like Alzheimer's take hold and you can't think of anything, you can't remember people, you're disconnected, the suffering that causes around the family. So using exemplification about how even with the preconditions there is still suffering that has emerged, and trying to weigh why that suffering is the most important thing to avoid in the debate versus the bad suffering, the bad experiences that can exist, that if you're able to convince the panel that nothing can reach the suffering of death, as in the process of dying, then yeah. The third thing is you could apply this beyond the human context in a way that can outframe top half. Because top half might become human-centric. They'll be like, oh, humans' lives, their love, their lost. You can also just think about how this technology could be applicable to all sentient life, or all life in general. This allows you to access argumentation about life preservation in general, and maybe argumentation. It depends how. It does depend on how vague the preference utilitarian argument is. Like if opening government's preference utilitarian argument is a pure principle about the nature of preferences, then I don't think this reframe would work. But if their argumentation was specifically intuitions about human preferences, as in humans being able to choose to do X and Y, and why the intuitions would be trying to convince the judges that as humans you want to do X and Y, you could explain why you're minimizing the suffering of all individuals, both human and non-human, sentient and non-sentient, and scale the level of suffering reduction higher. This would be more important if no principle has been existed on top half and you yourself don't want to make a principle, which is fair enough, you don't have to. So this could be a way to scale to least suffering. The last could just be undermining systems of oppression, right? You might want to have a creative argument that mortality is what bounds society into cycles of oppression. Things like capitalism, that some may argue is tyrannical because it means you have to sell your labor in exchange for food so you don't die, goes away at the point at which the threat of death doesn't happen. So if opening, I mean, this is dependent on opening government arguing that successfully the technology becomes massively accessible, but it's likely that opening opposition have conceded to that because that's the way they access the idea of coercion, which is probably an argument that some on and op's going to make. That's probably more persuasive than arguing it doesn't happen, even if it is a knife. If closing opposition did that and opening opposition didn't. You can argue why systems of oppression, things like police brutality, totalitarian states, probably just don't exist, right? Like, the reason totality and oppression exists is because the ultimate fear of death and suffering and poverty. Like, people hold food away from you so that you have to do things in exchange for the basic satisfaction of existence. But if now I have technology for immortality, that means I can be shredded by bullets against my totalitarian state, or I don't have to accept the bounds of the state to actually exist. This just removes you could argue, the worst form of coercion, which is coercion of the agent, as in making the agent do what the agent doesn't want to do. And you could argue that this is a better form of satisfaction to preference utilitarian argument, if you wanted to. Also just the consequential harms about why all this is bad. In closing opposition, here you maybe want to be like the closing opposition in the Euros final this year, or the year before this was recorded. You might want to argue that, yeah, life sucks, life is shit, but the shittiness of life is what makes it good, i.e., nature, the disease is instrumentally valuable because of the unique meaning it provides is the thing that gives life its meaning, i.e., people making trade-offs, but also caring, having a family, the fact that you need to make sacrifices for other individuals is what actually is the beauty of the relationship. It makes life worth living. Here you're trying to sell the message that the value of life is not just the experiences, but a type of experience, i.e., sacrificial experiences that can't happen if you are immortal. The second is just a precondition game. You could just try to argue that a lot of the comparative utility arguments from Gov don't happen. You can't get out of every Gov argument that could exist in the world, but you could theoretically get out of all of the Gov arguments that did exist in the world. As in, both government teams in a debate that you existed in, as closing opposition, you get the justice of having watched all the substantive arguments generated. You could use a precondition game in order to wipe them out if the Gov teams have been unstrategic by not recognizing that a lot of their arguments don't fall around the precondition. I.e., if the only argument that comes from government bench is about diseases, then use preconditions viably to knock that out of the debate and weigh on something that isn't that. The last could be extracting value from technological use, i.e., you could try to flip the idea of oppression systems to be more imaginative and to think about the different types of oppression that might now exist. Like, systems of extortion and oppression are inventive in the types of things they ask for, as in what is a state, and people who are beholden and wanting power and enrichment, as in they just get the ego boost from it, but also means they get the dispel, like, there's still qualities of life that exist outside this world, right? Like, I imagine living in shit for an eternity is probably a worse experience than living in a gold castle, being fed delicious food and having loads of sex and everything. Like, that experience probably is higher than, so there are still levels of experience is what I'm saying. So you can imagine if people are of a higher level of experience, they still want to extract and maintain their position. So you could ask in closing opposition, how do they do that and how does that remain permanent? So you could argue maybe, like, the idea that comes to me is people may still wish to have kids, right? People still may wish to have children and have that parental relationship, but just because a kid is born to immortal parents doesn't presume that kid is immortal in themselves, right? So higher ups may use this technology and the threat that your kid may die unless they get access to this type of technology. Here you might want to respond to the argumentation for opening government about how accessible this is. You can see it is widely accessible, but has restrictions based upon this. Here you don't knife your opening opposition, because opening opposition's arguments about coercion, you're just arguing, yes, they become coercive, and this is what it means to become coercive. People will do anything to make sure their kid doesn't die, especially when they know they themselves won't die, because they have already bought into this game because their parents made sure they did things in order to get that technology for their kids, which is now them. So you can argue what this could be. This could be, I don't know, being a servant to them, i.e., a worse form of oppression because it may last forever. There might be cycles, there might be like gradations of this, like still having to work just forever, as in like having to make the cheese for the rich people to eat. but now you don't die, so you just do it forever. And you're like, maybe some people make this trade-off in their mind that, oh, maybe one day my kid, if I give them the immortal technology, will be rise up to these people. And it's just the same psychology that exists in people now, as in, yeah, a lot of people whose lives are awful have kids, not because they either just because they recognize life is shit, but they don't recognize that their kid's life is also now going to be shit, but also the hope that these people will be better now. So all you do is you exacerbate the oppression of the world by scaling it forever. That's something that maybe could be done in closing opposition. Cool, so this is 2 hours of me ranting, and now my flatmate doesn't like me anymore. So, this is the types of argumentation, mechanization, exemplification of the framing and lessons that are throughout the SSDC videos you could have used in these motions. I hope this has been useful. At the very least, it was instrumentally useful for me to actually do matter prepping. And I've come up with some good mechs for my head now. So, hopefully this is useful. If you thought about any mechs that I didn't, or reject any mechs, feel free to comment and help other people out. See you around.